ويركز في نسخته للسنة الحالية للعام 2021 على ترسيخ ثقافة الابتكار والعمل نحو مستقبل دولة الإمارات في الخمسين عاما القادمة. ومن منطلق حرص وزارة المالية على المشاركة الدائمة والمتميزة في هذا الحدث، نرحب بكم في برنامجنا لهذا العام بعنوان الابتكار والثروة العامة، والذي يتضمن جلسات شيقة مع متحدثين رئيسيين متخصصين في مجالاتهم، وجلسات حوارية وتفاعلية بمشاركتكم. وفي مقدمة برنامجنا لهذا اليوم يسرنا دعوة سعادة يونس حاجي الخوري وكيل وزارة المالية لتقديم كلمته الترحيبية، فليتفضل مشكورا.
أصحاب السعادة، السيدات والسادة، الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نيابة عن سمو الشيخ حمدان بن راشد آل مكتوم نائب حاكم دبي وزير المالية، ومعالي عبيد حميد الطاير وزير الدولة للشؤون المالية، يسعدني أن أرحب بحضوركم معنا اليوم في برنامج وزارتكم وزارة المالية لشهر الابتكار بعنوان الابتكار والثروة العامة، والذي تشارك فيه الوزارة ضمن فعاليات الإمارات تبتكر 2021، الحدث الوطني السنوي الذي يهدف إلى ترسيخ ونشر ثقافة الابتكار وبناء وتطوير القدرات والمواهب والكفاءات الوطنية، وتحفيز الجهات الحكومية والقطاع الخاص والأفراد على تبني ممارسات الابتكار. ويكتسب الحدث هذا العام أهمية خاصة بتزامنه مع الاستعدادات للاحتفال باليوبيل الذهبي لتأسيس دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة، باعتبار أن أفضل طريقة للاستعداد للمستقبل هي من خلال إعادة اكتشاف الموارد المتاحة وتبني استراتيجيات جديدة لاستغلالها بشكل مبتكر بما يحقق أفضل النتائج. السيدات والسادة، الحضور الكريم، تعتبر دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة من الدول السباقة في المنطقة والعالم في مواكبة التطور التقني والريادة في الابتكار. فقبل أيام قليلة أضافت دولة الإمارات إنجازاً تاريخياً جديداً إلى قائمة إنجازاتها العالمية بوصول مسبار الأمل إلى المريخ، لتكون الإمارات أول دولة عربية وخامس دولة على مستوى العالم تصل إلى المريخ، وذلك بقيادة فريق عمل إماراتي من الشباب الواعد ليجسد هذا الإنجاز طموح دولة الإمارات وسعيها إلى صناعة أدوات المستقبل وابتكار تقنياته، حيث يمثل قطاع الفضاء أحد ركائز المستقبل لدولة الإمارات لدفع عجلة النمو ودعم استراتيجيات التنوع الاستراتيجي الاقتصادي. وباتت الإمارات محط أنظار العالم كنموذج لتحدي المستقبل وتخطيه، محققة الإنجاز تلو الآخر، والذي لم تكن أبداً وليدة الصدفة، بل هي نتاج جهد وعمل ورؤية حكيمة لقيادتنا الرشيدة في رسم خطط استراتيجية طموحة وطويلة الأمل لبناء اقتصاد معرفي مستدام ومجتمع قائم على العلم والمعرفة والابتكار. السيدات والسادة، الحضور الكريم، نعمل في وزارة المالية ضمن منظومة متكاملة تعتمد الابتكار منهجاً وأسلوب عمل وجزءاً لا يتجزأ من أي ممارسة أو عملية أو خدمة تقدمها الوزارة، ونحرص على توفير بيئة حاضنة ومحفزة للابتكار من خلال إطلاق مبادرات وبرامج من شأنها ترسيخ ونشر ثقافة الابتكار واعتمادها كمقوم رئيسي لخططنا المستقبلية وركيزة أساسية لا غنى عنها للعمل الحكومي، بما يدعم تحقيق رؤية الإمارات بأن تصبح في مصاف الحكومات الأكثر ابتكاراً على مستوى العالم، وبما يحقق مستهدفات مئوية الإمارات 2071 بأن تكون الإمارات مركزاً للابتكار في المنطقة والعالم. وقد حققت وزارة المالية في مسيرتها إنجازات غير مسبوقة على صعيد الابتكار ومواكبة التطور الهائل والمتسارع في عالم التكنولوجيا والاستفادة من تطبيقات الذكاء الاصطناعي في رقمنة العمل المالي الحكومي وتطويره عبر توفير خدمات وحلول رقمية مبتكرة وفق أفضل المعايير العالمية الأمر الذي يرتقي بدوره بكفاءة وفعالية العمليات، ويحقق أعلى درجات السعادة لدى المتعاملين، ويعزز من مستوى الرضا لديهم. كما تعمل الوزارة على تحقيق أهدافها في مجال الابتكار من خلال أحد أهم مشاريعها الاستراتيجية في هذا المجال، ألا وهو صندوق محمد بن راشد للابتكار، الذي يعمل بدوره على تقديم الدعم للمبتكرين والمساهمة بشكل فعال في دعم بيئة الابتكار. السيدات والسادة، الحضور الكريم، تواصل وزارتكم وزارة المالية مسيرتها الابتكارية، وتبني مستقبلها وخططها الاستراتيجية لدعم النمو المستدام من خلال إطلاق العديد من المبادرات والبرامج التي تهدف إلى دفع عجلة الابتكار والإبداع في كل المجالات، لتحقيق رؤية قيادتنا الرشيدة في تعزيز ثقافة الرقم واحد في مختلف المجالات، مستنيرين بمقولة صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن راشد آل مكتوم نائب رئيس الدولة رئيس مجلس الوزراء حاكم دبي رعاه الله، أن هدف الإمارات الرقم واحد عالميا في كافة المجالات، ومسيرتنا التنموية في تسارع يومي، والمنافسة لن تزيدنا إلا تفوقا وتميزا. وفي النهاية لا يسعني إلا أن أرحب بكم مجددا، وأتمنى لكم جميعا تجربة ملهمة ومتميزة خلال برنامجنا الابتكار والثروة العامة. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
نشكر سعادة يونس حاجي الخوري وكيل وزارة المالية على كلمته الترحيبية، وندعو السيد روي شبرت. السيد روي مذيع سابق في قناة BBC ومحاور جلسات وكاتب ومحاورنا الرئيسي لجلساتنا لهذا اليوم، والتي ستناقش موضوع الابتكار في الثروة العامة والقيادة إلى ما وراء التغييرات المستقبلية، وذلك للبدء في الجلسات الرئيسية لليوم. Welcome, Roy. The mic is yours. You may start.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everybody. BBC, that was a very, very long time ago. My role today is to help make this event as relevant as possible for you, whether you work for government, business, or maybe you're a student. We're in 3 parts this morning. The first and second parts will be in English, and the third one will be in Arabic. Before I introduce our first speaker today, though, let me say that there will be an opportunity for you to submit questions. So would you please use the Q&A facility in Zoom? Only the Q&A facility. I will do my best to include as many questions as possible, but obviously, could I have them in English, not in Arabic, because I can't read Arabic. I'm reminded of a saying, which is the future belongs only to those who have adequately prepared for it. And preparing the UAE for the next 50 years is absolutely essential to create a firm financial foundation. I'd like to introduce now our first speaker, who is in Stockholm in Sweden, where it's even colder and darker than it is for me here in the UK. Dag Data advises private and public sector clients across the world on unlocking the value of public assets, and we'll understand why that's important in a moment, and also how that relates to innovation. He's worked in over 30 countries on a permanent or a project basis and served as a non-executive director of both listed and private companies. And crucially, for 3 years, he led the comprehensive restructuring of Sweden's national portfolio of commercial assets, which was the first attempt by any government to systematically restructure the ownership and management of government enterprises and real estate. And that led to a value increase of the portfolio twice that of the local stock market, and that helped boost economic growth and fiscal space. He's the author of The Public Wealth of Nations, and both The Economist and The Financial Times voted it Best Book of the Year when it came out, and he writes regularly in international media. Welcome to you, Dag. I have to warn you, though, that after your presentation, I will be interviewing, and if you have any questions, then please submit them. So Dag, just make sure your microphone is on so we can hear you from Stockholm in Sweden. It's over to you. I don't know if you listened very carefully, you could hear 500 or 600 people cheering and clapping that they could hear you all over the Middle East. That was wonderful. Dag, can I ask you, without me wasting any more of this precious time, to ask you to go straight into your presentation? I don't know if you heard me explaining my understanding of public wealth. I did say that most cities and governments have no idea what their public assets are. Please don't contradict me. I'm sure you won't.
No, absolutely not. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure. I will start right away with the Hope mission, which is a great symbol for what I am about to talk about. This is the third mission ever to Mars and the first Arabic voyage to outer space. And it's building on a great tradition of Arabic sailors conquering the seas over several thousands of years. But it's also built on another Arabic tradition, which is numbers, reliable data, and science, which was absolutely essential. Mathematics and astronomy was essential to be able to conquer the seas over thousands of years. And now the UAE is doing the same thing with its Hope mission. This ties very well in to public commercial assets or public wealth, because originally mathematics was, you could say, invented by Arabs in the early 800s. And then astronomy and mathematics was very closely tied. And so was accounting. And accounting was then developed further, thanks to Arabic numbers in the 1200s by the Italians. And who invented the balance sheet. And today we can see by using accountings that governments own a lot of assets and shouldn't really only be talking about a budget, how to spend their money, but actually how to manage their assets. And the way we look at public assets or public wealth is through two segments. One is real estate, which is the biggest segment. And then you have the operational side, which are transport like ports, airports, and subways, etc., utilities, and then financial services like banks. And the public wealth is really the assets minus the liabilities. That's the net worth. Countries have, just like a stock market, over the last 2,000 years, been going up and down, and empires have been made and broken down. And you can clearly see, if you look at this like if it was a stock chart, that China was there, one of the big countries in the world, and is now coming back. And Italy enjoyed very much the innovation of the accounting and the balance sheet, which was then harnessed much more efficiently by Western Europe, countries like Holland and the UK. And then ultimately in the 1900s, America came up with the invention of the dollar and became one of the biggest creditors and financial markets in the world. New Zealand was the first country in the world to apply also modern accounting to the government. And this has made it able for them to withstand financial crisis and pandemics. And it was probably one of the reasons why they managed the current pandemic better than most countries in the world. So the question is, can the public sector, work and actually incentivize or even drive innovation? Or is it like some people would claim that the public sector would only suffocate the innovative climate? The answer to that question is yes, the government can participate and drive and help and incentivize innovation. But the balance is very delicate. It's not a matter of replacing the private sector, what the private sector can do, but it's actually helping them when they can't do what the private sector is best at, innovation. So it's the multitude of initiatives and the support of the private sector and the cooperation of the private sector that is the essence of creating that climate that catapults a country through innovation and thereby increasing the productivity and thereby economic growth and jobs, etc. And this is done just like we've seen in Singapore, in Sweden, that you separate the ownership of public assets, public commercial assets, from that of policy, so that you allow the public commercial assets to be managed in a really, truly professional and commercial way. If you're able to think like this, in separating the public and the private management, doesn't need, the ownership can still be public, but the management should be separated and professionally managed and based on financial numbers and a proper balance sheet and accounting, then the sky is the limit. Thank you, Roy.
Thank you, Dag. I'm delighted that we got there in the end. While I was listening to you, I was reminded of an article I saw in the FT only a day or so ago, which was actually talking about how countries like the UK are suffering with innovation, and the economy is stagnating. And there was a quote from that article which I thought was quite interesting. It said, "Government support has played a central role in developing almost all of the fundamental technologies of the 20th and the 21st century. As a former BBC reporter, it pains me to say something positive, but it sounds like the Ministry of Finance and the UAE government is actually doing the right thing by bringing this to centre stage."
Absolutely. I think this is an excellent initiative, and the government is absolutely necessary and has been crucial in developing many of the innovations that we have. The delicate balance is to not to do what the private sector can do, but try to help it when there is no funding for certain types of innovation or very early stage, when there is a need for financial support that the private sector cannot handle. And to create that delicate relationship, that cooperation, that is the essence of creating a fertile ground for innovations.
I mean, you were talking about the HOPE probe, which is a massive achievement by anybody's standards, but for the UAE to have done it, I know that there are so many people who are so proud of it. But one of the things about space exploration is the importance of data. What about the importance of data when it comes to managing public assets?
Yes, this is the strange, as we mentioned, that data, the numbers these are Hindu-Arabic numbers created 1,000 years ago almost, and accounting, it was invented 800 years ago, and that is the basis for the wealth that we are all enjoying today, but mainly created by the private sector. And accounting is essential for capital markets, for any private business or any wealth that we see today. Yet governments are not using proper accounting today.
Now, you talk about the difference between cost accounting and accrual accounting. For finance people, this is easy to understand. For non-finance people like me, and a lot of business people actually, how could you describe the difference between the two without please getting technical?
Well, cash accounting is what governments are using. This is like when you get your bank statements or your credit card statement. It tells you what money has come in and what has gone out. That is not enough to create a balance sheet, because a balance sheet also requires that you have promised somebody to buy their car in 3 months. It will not show up on your bank account because that is a promise and to buy this. And maybe you have also lent somebody money. That doesn't, I'm going to, when you're buying your house, I will lend you X amount of dollars. That doesn't show either. So you need a balance sheet to understand if you really are if your financial health is good or bad, if you have a strong net worth, assets minus liabilities, and for that you need accrual accounting, which records everything that you are promising or have been promised.
So a lot of things which have not been on the balance sheet will start to appear on the balance sheet.
Yes.
Is accrual accounting just a fancy, clever way for accountants to show that you've got more wealth than you thought you had?
No, it's the contrary, because it's if you look at the UAE.
Is that your alarm to try and get you to get up?
Yeah, no, to stop talking. If you look at the UAE, it's probably number 35 by a measure called GDP. GDP is a statistical measure. It's not financial. So it's not very accurate. It's not very useful in any way. But if you look at the balance sheet of the UAE, it's probably one of the top 5 countries in the world. And that is a very different, and then you can understand that you are not using, if you're looking at GDP, you are not using your entire strength to reach Mars, if you like, financially, because you're punching way below your weight.
So, but this is all about disclosure, isn't it? And I also saw something. It's pretty bizarre that the timing of all of this coincides with something that Saudi Arabia have just announced, that they're looking to add things to their balance sheet as well. Can you explain what's happening there?
Yes, I mean, many countries are understanding that this is, especially asset-rich countries, realize that, you know, if we don't have a full view of what we own, but what we owe, so the debt is usually very transparent. And I prefer not to think about this as a way of disclosure that we have to show somebody else this, because secrecy is often a very treasured phenomenon in the Arab world and in the Middle East. It's not about, you know, that the whole world needs to know this, but you need to know what you own. That's why I compare this with military comparisons or anything. If you don't know where your resources are, you can't employ them properly. So it's knowing where your financial assets are and how they are structured it's a decision tool. It's for decision making. It's for it's for the government to be able to take the proper decisions.
But doesn't it also create an environment that's conducive then for inward investment from?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Of course, if you choose to disclose this, of course, it's going to show a whole lot more trust, because if they see what you actually have and they see you have a capability of managing this in a professional way and in a commercial way, just like the private sector. I mean, you trust somebody to do business with if you can understand how they are managing and how well they're managing their assets. That creates trust. So yes, by having a disclosure on this, it will encourage private sector investments, foreign direct investments, and that will of course also catapult innovation and you know, this holy cooperation between the private and the public sector.
Well, there's just been the first question that's been submitted, so thank you for whoever did this. There is a private sector element, it says, but there's also the role of universities and think tanks that should enable innovation. How should public sector funds approach the enablement of that tripartite relationship?
Well, I mean, I think the important thinking here is that in many parts of the world, you have huge government ownership of assets and universities. And the point here is that we should think less about whether it's public or privately owned. The important thing is if it's publicly owned by the government, that they are behaving in a very commercial and you can call it in a private sector way, so that they are as agile and not mixing politics with the commercial side, because this is creating the independence for the university or for the public asset management holding company, if you like, so that they can think and act as if they were an agile private sector player. That is the essence.
Okay, so how can you speed up an innovation culture? Because the one thing about innovation is speed is incredibly important. And I'm not talking about the UAE government here. I'm talking about all governments generally. Yeah. They're renowned for being particularly slow. So how can everybody speed up to really leverage this hidden wealth?
Well, first of all, you have to have a very clear understanding what you own. In other words, you have to have the accounting, you have to have the financial data. I mean, you can't send a probe to Mars if you don't have the numbers, etc., and be able to navigate. Again, back to the old Arabic sea merchants who understood numbers and astronomy, etc. So we have to understand the numbers, but then we have to create the institutions, if you like, the boats or the Mars, the Hope probe, that enables us to do this. So we have to create institutions that are nimble and agile and independent from politics, so that they can start acting, recruiting the right people. You have to, if you're going on a sea mission or on a space mission, you have to have astronauts. You can't have people who are skilled at something else. So horses for courses, as you say in English, and you can only you recruit the right people if you have proper independent institutions that can attract the right people.
Okay, this is going to be politically incorrect, but innovation usually comes from young people. However, power is usually held by older people. How can you create an environment where the older people will actually listen to the younger people?
Ah, that's interesting. Again, I think it comes down to having the courage to create independent institutions that actually are allowed, be it a university, be it a commercial entity, that actually allow them to be commercial, to fail. We have to fail. The Japanese have a saying that, falling 7 times, stand up 8. That's the essence of life. And with innovations, that's absolutely true. It's probably 1 of 8 that will succeed. And you have to allow that atmosphere of failure. That's nothing wrong with that. And young people have to have that stamina to carry it through.
Excuse me, young people have the stamina. It's older
Exactly.
that don't have the stamina.
Exactly.
There's been another question which I think relates to this. It says, does that mean that unbiased, non-influential, transparent decision criteria need to be designed? And how would you eliminate the problem of understanding that disruption is most often not recognized by the average person? So how do you create a path that's not been used yet?
That's a very interesting question, and you can't do that overnight. I mean, you create the institutions. It's like saying, I mean, we build the cities, and then we shape the cities, and the cities then shape us. I mean, you have to, the intelligence of the older people, like you can say, or the government, and is to have the wisdom to create this kind of atmosphere, to create the playing field that will allow failure, that would allow unbiased decisions, and so that people who have the intellect could go out and try this.
Well, to be fair, the federal government is looking far into the future. I mean, they're looking for the next 50 years. I mean, we have a very large young population in the region, and it's about designing and creating a world that is fit for purpose for the next generations. So how can you create this culture within a region that perhaps doesn't have that culture and has never had that culture in the past? Because it's a massive shift in attitude to change, perhaps.
Well, I mean, that we're coming into historical, but I'm not sure that I would rather see that this part of the world has a huge tradition of adventure, commercial exploration. So I think it does have a history and a culture of innovation and exploration, etc., which is the attitude which is necessary. However, as with the case with Sweden, which had an innovative culture, but then was suffocated or drawn down by the public sector becoming too large. So I think that is the delicate balance, not allowing the public sector to become too large, or if it is very large, creating the structures of the public sector so that it is not suffocating that climate or the whole economy by being too dominant, but perhaps having a structure that allows for innovation and failure and adventure.
So what do you think is the scale of opportunity within the UAE?
Well, I mean, it's enormous. If you stop thinking about statistical numbers like GDP, but instead focus on the asset side, and the asset side of the UAE is enormous. It's probably top 5 or at least top 10 in the world. That's the scale of opportunity. That's where a country like this should be if it manages its public commercial assets properly.
And how would you summarize the key strengths then within the UAE?
Oh, the key strength is definitely its balance sheet and its youth. The people, it's a very young population, and it also with a very good education. To me, it's a matter of, as the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu said, it's a matter of organization and communication. It's down to the government to structure this in a proper way, and then the sky is the limit.
So I find it fascinating to hear someone with your background as a venture capitalist and as an economist talking about the asset of youth. I wouldn't have thought that's something you could easily quantify.
No, I'm not sure you can, but you always look at a country and there is more hope if there is a young population, because one, the future belongs to the young, but it's also, when a country has a young population, it tends to look to the future. In places like Europe, the population is much older, which makes the government much more cautious. It's a government of trying to preserve things. While with a young population, you look forward, you're looking to build the future. And that is an asset.
At the very beginning, when I was talking about my experiences, actually from having a conversation with you in the past, where you were talking about, local governments and city governments don't always have a very good, accurate grasp of the assets that they currently hold. The UAE is currently going through data collection right now, which is obviously a very sensible thing to do. In your experience, what do most governments learn once they've actually completed that data gathering task?
Well, first of all, the biggest surprise is often the real estate, because what is called the cadastre, which is the system where you have recorded the boundaries and the ownership of various plots of real estate. That is usually not something that is well recorded, and also the public ownership is less well understood. So that is a huge surprise to any government in the world. Real estate is the big unknown, but because of the accounting, because of the lack of modern accounting in most governments, there is no proper understanding of the value of a utility, of a water utility, electricity utility, or of an airport or a port, or a subway system, because we haven't applied these modern methods to the government side as we would have in a company. A company wouldn't own any asset without having it proper valued, and thereby, if you have it proper valued, you will also feel a pressure to manage it properly and get some yield out of it.
So that is the next stage. Obviously, you have to understand what is the size and scale of your assets. What are the potential outcomes then for a more professional approach to public asset management that you're talking about here?
Well, once you know the value of something, it's like if you had a number of assets, like a number of houses, etc., and you were not living in all of them, you would follow the value of those houses or apartments, and you would make sure that they are constantly rented out so that you have a yield from them, and you will monitor that, of course, like a hawk, because you are concerned. Should I keep them? Should I sell them? Should I renovate? Do I need to do maintenance, etc.? Do I have the right tenants? Can I get a higher rent if I reshape these apartments or these houses? You will think about that constantly, and that is driven by the fact that you are well aware of the value of the assets and whether the yield that you are getting is comparable to what other people are getting.
What I find fascinating is in cities and countries all over the world, many governments feel that they're actually very poor, when in fact you have repeatedly told them, actually, no, you're not. The UAE is in a somewhat much better position than many other organizations and governments around the world. What advice would you give to experts? So I'm not suggesting that you're patronizing anybody, but this is a new world for a lot of people. What advice would you give to financial professionals in the UAE where they need to put most of their attention in the future to really ensure that they maximize yields on these public assets that they will discover or have already discovered?
To a financial, if we separate financial professionals will see this as common sense. As I would say, so would my grandmother, who was managing a farm and had a lot of houses, etc., but were told by the bank that she was bankrupt until she realized that she could use those assets for something else. The problem we have with governments is that it's mainly influenced by economists, and when you study economy, you don't learn anything about accounting, and accounting is essential. If there's any message hidden here, it's not very well hidden. It's that accounting is essential to manage assets, and this is what's missing in most countries, apart from a place like New Zealand, who is so well focused on net worth, the assets minus the liabilities. Most other countries just talk about the debt. When you open a paper, you read this country has too much debt over GDP, which is a completely meaningless number. It would be much more clever if countries were comparing each other to see if they were healthy by looking at the net worth, the assets minus the liabilities. These are reliable numbers, and they are sensible numbers.
There's another question, which I think is a fantastic question. When public funds are invested in commercial assets, the government is normally requiring strict controls and close supervision than the private sector would normally require. Can this hinder the innovative actions and freedom to fail and retry? Whoever asked that question, great question.
It is a great question, because I've been on the government side. I've represented the government, and I've been the president of the holding company. And the problem is, as soon as the government is involved, you are actually using the people's money, the taxpayers' money, which means that everybody, the media, everybody feels that you're responsible to everybody. And that is correct. The people should hold you accountable. Absolutely. The problem is also then to allow some independence when you're investing, because if you are politically motivated when you do that investment, it is likely to fail. So you will, when you as an investor 1,000 years ago invested in a boat to go for silk in China 1,000 years ago, you have to allow the captain the freedom of choosing the route and how to sail the boat and how to maneuver it from pirates and storms and whatever. You can't be there as an investor just because you have a lot of money to tell the captain that. You have to allow the captain to be the captain of the ship. And this is sometimes difficult to balance with that sense of accountability that the government is always held to.
So it's really the balance or the imbalance of control versus freedom of the market.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that has occurred to me by listening to you is that it's highly complex in one way, but it's very simple in another. I mean, do you think that in the next, say, 5 years, that there will be sufficient reassurance on the part of people in government to say, actually, it's okay to do it this different way, and the trust levels will go up between public and private? I don't want to imply that there's always conflict, but we know that there is usually a conflict of short-term versus long-term, for example.
Yes, I would rather claim the opposite, actually, because I think if you have a balance sheet, you're forced to be more long-term. You will see that you have assets and they require maintenance, but if you have them inside a government, you don't see the value and you don't see the need for maintenance because you don't have depreciations. Now we're getting into technical stuff, but this is, if you don't see the value of an asset, I mean, it's like any person. If you would own a car and you had no understanding of the value, you wouldn't care for it as much as if you're reminded of the value of that car or that house every day. You will be very careful how you tend to it. So understanding the value of your assets is crucial for its survival.
But perhaps this is what I was trying to get at. If you have a deeper understanding of what your assets are, you're then far more likely to take a longer term view because you can see that there will be a longer term return on those assets. Whereas if you don't have that accounting system in place, you can't possibly understand, therefore you can't possibly have that longer term view.
Yes, if it's not measured, it doesn't count.
Okay, so in terms of looking to the future, if a government is demonstrating and using its assets far more wisely and in a more commercial way, what does that do to the overall mindset of a government? And the reason I say that is that I mentioned it earlier on that many governments think they're broke when in fact they're not. When a government knows it's not broke, how adventurous can it then be?
It can be as adventurous as the networks allow them, or as their imagination allows them to be. If by focusing on, let's say, the net worth, you will feel much more assured that you have a future than if by looking at and listening to economists who are saying your debt over GDP is horrendous, and you have this sense of feeling that you're sick or broke. Well, you're not. If somebody tells you to, stand up and start walking, it's a healing effect, and it's going to make you much more confident to look into the future, of course.
So if you had a crystal ball, and based on what you've understood that the UAE is doing right now, I mean, what do you see as the future for the UAE?
Oh, the future is very bright. I mean, provided that they are able to understand their strengths and their right place in the world and in history. I think, again, the sky is the limit. I mean, this is amazing. I mean, very few countries have a balance sheet like this and have these opportunities. It's turning that balance sheet, which is today very much carbon based, or at least half of it, and a very big part is invested overseas, and turning that into a dynamic environment at home. That is an amazing challenge, but it's a wonderful challenge. Most other countries are just loaded with debt and with an older population. I mean, this is the picture is completely different for a place like the UAE.
So what are your personal feelings about the Hope probe that landed on Mars recently from the UAE?
Oh, I think it is fantastic. I think it's a great achievement, but it's also a wonderful symbol of a country looking at the future and applying innovation and science to achieve this, to achieve a brighter future.
Dag, it's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you today. Thank you very much indeed for your presentation as well. Sorry we had a few early glitches, but you soldiered on brilliantly. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Rest of the day, and enjoy your 4 or 5 hours of sunshine you get in Sweden during the winter.
Thank you. Will do.
All right, that was Dag Detter. Thank you so much indeed. Okay, in a few minutes, we're going to be starting part 2 of today's program, which is called Leadership Beyond Disruption. And we'll be hearing from a futurist, Terence Mowry. But before we do that, let me introduce the Mohammed bin Rashid Innovation Fund, which was launched by the Ministry of Finance as part of the UAE's National Innovation Strategy, which was to identify and nurture the best talent by attracting high potential innovators to design and create the UAE future. Now, the MBRIF has been supporting innovators through its 2 programs since 2016. I'll be back in a few minutes, so please stay with us. But first, let's take a look at what its achievements have been so far. See you very soon for part 2. Disruption, and it'll be an opportunity for you to submit your questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. For anyone just joining us, there is also live interpreting in Arabic in Zoom as well. That's at the bottom of the screen. Now, we talked about public assets and creating a firm financial foundation for the future, but we're going to look at the future in a different way now from a true expert. Terence Mowry is the founder of Hack Future Lab, a global future trends think tank. He's also the co-chair of the Future of Work panel at MIT, no less, and holds entrepreneur mentorship in residence roles at the London School of Economics and the London Business School. His latest book is How to Win in the Age of Disruption, that's been described as a game changer by the Financial Times. Please welcome Terence Mowry. Hello, Terence.
Hi, Roy. Thank you for the fantastic introduction and a warm welcome to everybody. Greetings from a very chilly London. Today, I want to give you the equivalent of a double espresso to spark new thinking and to ask new types of questions, catalytic questions. What questions do you want to be remembered for? What's the bravest question you could ask this year? When you're operating at the edge of uncertainty, questions are at the heart of innovation. So I'm going to plant a narrative in the here and now. Yes, we are drowning in data. Over the next 5 years, 80 zettabytes, that's 80 trillion gigabytes, 56 times all the grains of sand on the planet. Yes, digitization is accelerating. Yes, disruption is happening and business models are going off like yogurt in the fridge. However, I truly believe that you are still in the driving seat. And it's about using your ras and your kelp. I hope my Arabic was good. So let's get started. A couple of months ago, I received an email from an executive assistant called Amy Ingram. The purpose of the email was to organize a meeting. When I got to connect with her boss, a CEO, he asked me a very strange question. What did I think of Amy's emails? It was a strange question to ask. He then said he had a confession. Amy was not human. She was AI. And the clue was in her initials, Amy Ingram, artificial intelligence. My first reaction was surprise. I'd been talking to AI. My second reaction was wonder. The future has already happened. The future has already happened. And so today is about reimagining relevancy. It's about embracing disruption. And it's about scaling a future that is innovative, profitable, and sustainable. So the future has already happened. And what this means for you is that you need to master the new logic of innovation. You're now competing on learning. You're competing on ecosystems. You're competing on physical and digital or phygital. You're competing on imagination, and you're competing on resilience and anti-fragility. Anti-fragility being able to bounce back from shock waves and disruptors. And so everybody keeps saying to me that data is the new oil. I disagree. I believe that attention is the new oil. It's scarce, it's limited, and it's under attack. If you think about it, information is just bits of data. Knowledge is connecting those bits of data together. Wisdom is transcendence. It's turning data into value and data into insight. So I want you to think about 4 types of attention in order to scale a sustainable, innovative, and profitable future. Number 1 is aim for 10x, not 10%. Fall in love with problems, not with ideas. Number 3, make contact early with all of your stakeholders and customers. And finally, number 4, remember that diversity is a superpower. Diversity of cognitive thinking, diversity of culture, and diversity of teams. Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity in the 21st century, and it's a superpower for scaling innovation. So everybody's talking about this word disruption. In the last quarter, disruption has been mentioned over 2,000 times in quarterly earnings reports. And there's a lot of hype and hysteria about this word disruption. Over the last year, I've heard about gene-edited babies in China, the world's first Bitcoin cafe in Geneva, and my personal favorite, I recently got invited to attend a blockchain yoga event. I know what you're thinking. I can't think of anything more disturbing than standing on my head whilst discussing the virtues of blockchain. But it doesn't stop there. We also have job titles being disrupted. Recent examples include innovation Sherpa, tech philosopher, and my personal favorite, director of disruption, who confessed to me that his job title was as popular as a funeral director. So in order to understand the future, in order to embrace disruption as a tailwind, in order to reimagine relevancy across your growth, across your operating models, and across your mindset, we need to go back in time, first of all. 100,000 years ago, we harnessed fire, which led to language. 10,000 years ago, we developed agriculture, which led to cities and commerce. 5,000 years ago, we invented writing in the wheel. And today, you are at an exciting new inflection point. This convergence of 5 innovation platforms: blockchain, genome sequencing, robotics, energy storage, and artificial intelligence. According to PwC and a new study, the internet added approximately $13 trillion of market equity capitalization over the last 20 years. Over the next 15 years, according to ARK Investments based in New York, we're looking at over $30 trillion added to market equity capitalization from these new innovation platforms. So what this means for you is three things. Number one, technology is eating the world. Number two, competitive lines are being redrawn. Who's your competition? We have Google moving into insurance. We have Airbnb moving into home loans. We have Amazon moving into everything. Also, we can say that companies are dying younger, from around 60 years of average lifespan to less than 15. In front of you, you can see some research from Hack Future Lab. The average time it takes to reach a valuation of $1 billion or more. That's a unicorn. But we don't stop at unicorns anymore. In this age of disruption, where it's no longer just about big or small, it's also about fast or slow. We also have decacorns. These are $10 billion valuations, and hectocorns, $100 billion valuations. A recent example of this was 2 weeks ago, a Chinese IPO, Kaohsiung, which means little hands, and that IPO'd for $160 billion. So what does this mean for you? It means four things. One, you need to create your next cutting edge by embracing these exponential technologies and turning disruption into opportunity and adversity into advantage. Number two, you need to fund future bets. Think 10x, not 10%. Number three, find ecosystem partners to scale with. The future is not ego, it's eco. It's about we, not me. According to the World Economic Forum, ecosystems, Costa Rica-like ecosystems, will represent a $60 trillion revenue pool over the next 5 years. Finally, you need to disrupt from the inside. This means harnessing uncertainty and using it as a unique inflection point for reinvention and reimagination. So I want to present you with 3 catalysts that you can launch, activate, and scale today to help you think and act like an innovator, whether you're an individual, a startup, an ecosystem provider, or even a government body. Catalyst number 1 is uncertainty. Why is it that last year was a record year for climate change and carbon dioxide emissions, and even extreme weather events, such as Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria? Why is it that according to Endelman, the trust index, only 58% of people around the planet believe that business models today are broken? I think the answer is a lack of purpose. Uncertain times requires certainty of purpose. Purpose is a clarifier, purpose is an energizer, purpose is a multiplier. And purpose gives you a no strategy as well. It helps you to focus on what really matters. You know, change, it used to happen as a breeze, didn't it? Now, it feels like a Category 5 typhoon, blurring of industry lines, economic and geopolitical uncertainty, disruptive technologies such as AI and robotics, shrinking of company and product lifespans, and a global pandemic. And what we can see here is actually the key is to be able to turn these disruptors and harness them and leverage them as value. I want you to think about a couple of big catalytic questions at this point and take a strategic pause. How do you unlock trapped value? There's value everywhere, isn't there? There's value in societies, value in untapped value in enterprises, untapped value in organizations. It's like idling capacity. It's like turning lead to gold and a moth to a butterfly. I want you to think about mega trends. For example, sustainability and thriving in a click economy. Clean, lean, inclusive, and circular is the new superpower of the 21st century. And you can turn these mega trends into value by thinking about relevancy, impact, and opportunity. A recent example of this, and a great example of to be the disruption and harness disruption as a tailwind behind you rather than a headwind, is a renewables company called Ørsted. It's transitioned from fossil fuel to 93% operating profit from offshore wind farms in less than 10 years. And it's a great example of what I call sisu. Sisu is a Finnish word, and it means Viking spirit, and it's at the heart of innovation. Because without innovation, there's no growth. Without innovation, there's no transformation. And without innovation, there's no resilience. So that's catalyst number one. Harness uncertainty as a unique reflection for relevancy and for embracing disruption as a tailwind. Catalyst number two then is trust. I believe trust is your North Star, and you should prioritize it for all of your ethical, moral, product decisions. If you think about it, trust is a confident relationship in the unknown, and it's at the heart of every action, relationship, transaction. Trust allows ideas to flow, and it's a conduit for change. And so what we're facing here in terms of a disruptor on the horizon is what I call a world of truth decay. My research at Hack Future Lab has shown that 10 out of 15 industries have suffered major trust breaches over the last 3 years. Think about false facts, alternative facts, fake news, tainted products. And so trust, you need to bake it into your culture. It's impossible to have a thriving, sustainable, profitable ecosystem of innovation without high levels of trust. So what does trust mean in 4 words? It means competence, it means reliability, it means empathy, and it means integrity. The first 2 are how you do it. The second 2 are why you do it. And so even trust has been disrupted. Money is the currency of transaction. Trust is the currency of innovation. And in terms of the evolution of trust, we've transitioned from local trust to institutional trust, and now distributed trust. And the enabler, the accelerator, is technology. And so what that means for you is trust leaps. To innovate at scale, to innovate at speed, to innovate in a sustainable way, you need to create future products or platforms or services or policies that allow for trust leaps. That means 3 things. It means navigating uncertainty, it means placing your faith in new platforms, and it means taking risks. In this age of disruption, where today is the slowest it will ever be in your lifetime, not taking a risk is a risk. And so that's catalyst number 2, which is trust is your North Star. My final catalyst, and it's a big one, is to go beyond your limits. Go beyond your limits. And what do I mean by that? Well, now is the time not to limit your challenges. It's the time to challenge your limits. And to thrive in this age of disruption, you need to think 10x, not 10%. What do I mean by that? I mean, be a blitz scaler. Blitz scalers are unicorns and decacorns and hectacorns that achieve multi-billion-dollar valuations within 5 years or less. Whether it's Tesla reimagining mobility, whether it's BYD reimagining sustainability, whether it's EDP Renewables or Pinterest or Twilio, these blitz scalers do 3 things really well. And it's the heart, it's the essence of innovation at scale. Number 1, they have visionary capital. They have a compelling vision to tackle some of the world's biggest challenges, whether that's food supply, clean energy, connectivity, or health. So visionary capital. Number 2, velocity. They re-architecting their business models and making them AI-centric. That means re-platforming to the cloud. My research at Hack Future Lab has shown that today, the Russell 3000 top companies, only 20% have re-platformed to the cloud today. And over the next 5 years, according to Satya Nadella at Microsoft, GDP spending on IT will go from 5% to 10%. So visionary capital, velocity, and the final secret power is vertical integration. To win in this new age of disruption, it's no longer just about scaling efficiency. It's also about scaling intelligence. I call it ROI, not just return on investment, return on intelligence, return on imagination, return on ideas, and return on integrity. And so what can you do today to reimagine relevancy, to embrace disruption, and to sustain long-term sustainable growth? What can you do today to fight complexity? Not with complexity, but with simplicity. What can you do today? Which old mindsets and operating models and assumptions about the world do you need to let go of? Because we often focus on thinking and learning, but to lead beyond disruption, you also need to prioritize rethinking and unlearning. And so here are 3 strategies for you to think about. Number 1, to reimagine relevancy is new growth. How successful are you at generating new growth? That could be new platforms, new products, new services, even new industries and new business models. And the key metric is revenue outside of the core. Number 2, how effectively are you repositioning yourself, re-embracing disruptors on the horizon? It could be regulation, could be competition, but I think one of your biggest disruptors today, whatever you do, is your citizen, is your customer. And finally, number 3 is financial impact. Can you show strong financial market performance, including compound annual growth rate? You know, a CEO said to me recently, this year is cancelled. I disagree. I think this year is a once in a lifetime opportunity to not just return to normal, but to reimagine relevancy. Ras and Kalb. So what will you do next today? What will your future self thank you for? You know, time is precious, so don't get trapped by dogma. Don't allow the noise of other people's thinking to drown out your own inner voice. Now is not the time for status quo. It's time for action. It's time for renewal, and it's time for reimagination. In life, nothing is to be feared, only understood. And the more you understand, the less you will fear. And in the words of Karl Popper, you have a moral obligation to innovate, because innovation is about vitality. It's about being alive, and it's about embracing the future and stepping into the unknown with courage. Today, I wanted to give you that double espresso to excite your mind. I wanted to help you reimagine relevancy, and I wanted to help you build a future that is more profitable, more innovative, and more sustainable. Thank you.
Terence, I think that was a double espresso. Thank you so much. Very, very stimulating. I have to be honest with you, I'm exhausted after that. There's so much in there. And I would just like to call for a moment of silence for the interpreters to give them a rest, although they may be AI powered, so I don't want to feel, I don't want to feel too sorry for a machine. And I was curious to know how on earth you would interpret Sisu, the Viking comment. Anyway, thank you. Stay with us, because we now have a panel discussion, and we have our panelists who've joined us. A very good morning to you, gentlemen. We have Dr. Ali Al-Hamadi, who's the co-founder of Farmin, and that is Farmin. I will ask you to tell us about that in a moment. And we also have Shazad Najib, who's the co-founder and CEO of Kinteract. So, Dr. Ali, unfair, but what did you take from Terence's presentation? Was there anything that you thought, yeah, this really does resonate well with the sort of world that we're working and developing a business in?
Well, I can't say enough about the presentation. It was an awesome one. I actually agree mostly with the last part that he was talking about the change that are happening. Like this year or last year in particular, we have seen accelerated change that was driven by the need. And instead of the change that was, okay, we will do it in the future, we have time to do it. Everything was put together and they had to act for it. And so we saw this action being done as fast as possible. We saw 10 years the work of 10 years being done in 1 year.
So does that frighten you or does it excite you? You haven't even told me about your business yet. I'm just curious to know your reaction.
Well, from one side, actually helped our business because our business is also based on remote technology. We are doing remote sensing, so our business was thriving because of this. But on the same time, it gave us opportunity as well. Like if I had to do a meeting, I would go to a different location every single time. And now that I am doing it remotely, I can do different work, different times. I can schedule more efficiently. So I can even work more, produce more products as well.
Okay.
But that's an amazing opportunity for us.
So tell us about farming. What are you?
Okay, so farming actually was an idea that was born just because of a pitch of a friend. So I was in the right place and I had the chance to pitch the idea to UAE Space Agency. And it was just an idea, it was more of a side project that connected three areas that I love. These areas being artificial intelligence, space, and as you can tell probably from the name, agriculture, right? So we wanted to call it farming just to represent that we are talking about agriculture. And later we also wanted to be a data center. So we are presenting it as data farm, right? We specified or we specialized in the beginning on agriculture, and we felt that we really developed a really good product for agriculture, but unfortunately we didn't find the market fit for it. So although the product was really good, there was lack of fit in the market itself.
So isn't the first rule of business, you go where the money is, and if the money isn't there, there isn't going to be a business. We'll come back to you. If I may, can I bring in Shazad Najib? Can you tell us what Kinteract is?
Hi, Roy. Yes, here at Kinteract, we set out in 2015, so a couple of years ago, to build a systemic approach to doing three things really: capturing, unifying, and personalizing a student's learning journey across their entire schooling and beyond. Put more simply, we're building a learning record that starts in early years and follows you through employment, and basically aids you through that process through personalization. We're not just looking at tracking academics, but also focusing on highlighting skills, competencies, and we're also solutioning new ways of evidencing progression beyond standard curricula. And obviously, though we've been working on this for a number of years, the pandemic has highlighted the acute problem that we were already addressing.
So this is something that is in a sector that isn't known for being innovative. You know, education is organized for the convenience of the lecturer or the availability of a lecture room. You're completely changing all of that. And as you say, the environment has dictated it. How has the teaching profession adopted this, and what do they feel about it? And what do students think about it?
So in our work with stakeholders, and most importantly, like the users of our product, we've been around for a few years, the following has kind of emerged. So number one is, look, how do you help somebody now? Right. So when innovation has to happen, as Terence has alluded, and just on his point, you know, I'm in definite agreement that attention is the new oil. Terence, I'm really sorry. I stopped. I lost attention after the yoga reference, right? So apologies for that. Hopefully I'll get a recording and I can do the rest, right? And so in that scenario is that you really got to help the user now, but also as an organization, you've got to look 10x, for example. You've got to look in the future. And what we've been able to do is say, look, how do we help them now in aiding education and its delivery digitally, right? So what we've been doing there is, look, how do we help the teacher, the user? We all know the issues of, having either people in our families or others who have the pain in terms of, there was no playbook in managing a pandemic, and how do you do learning? But we've been able to help that process because a few years ago, we set out to automate teacher workflow and help in the recruitment and retention of the profession, right? So we're helping the immediacy of the problem through our platform. So we're helping to facilitate learning, remedial learning, accelerating learning. One of the really interesting things about the pandemic, and I'm not going to use that word furthermore in my answers, right? Is really where a lot of times we focus on the negatives. We focus on the fact that there's been disruption, which we're not going to deny. There has been disruption, and the digital divide is the problem that we need to focus on because lack of access to either devices or connectivity. But there has been many examples where certain learners have actually accelerated, and also certain teachers have now thrived in being able to deliver remotely, for example. So it's really how do we focus on both elements in terms of the remediation, but also the acceleration. And what we've been also focused on is then what does the future look like? How are we then using these data points, as Terence alluded to then help in the future? So how do we do that? And our central proposition is, and the last bit I'm going to say is, we're advocating what we're calling an entire life cycle approach to education. The ability to frame challenges and opportunities from early years to employment, which we believe is critical. And as a consequence of that, you have two-way communication in this approach, because this means that you allow policymakers and also the users to assess and impact changes both vertically and horizontally in the education system. And it was great to see that Terence also aligned to point number 3 in my answer.
I mean, it's interesting that you can do that once you get given the keys to the room, that you can actually do this. There's a question that was submitted. It says, if you as a private sector are bringing a disruptive solution for an existing problem in the public sector, how do you convince government to get public funds or to be more free to change? I mean, that's an absolutely perfect question for someone who is trying to do what you're doing in an environment that is not always open to it.
Yes, exactly. A great question. So I'll briefly answer and also let Dr. Ali answer as well. So the scenario is in our adoption in the United Arab Emirates, and we've been in the region for about 5 years now. It's really, we first wanted, you've got to prove your value. You have to prove value first and foremost. And so we were fortunate that we were embedded in a number of the private schools in the region, one of the most notable groups in the region. We built that out and extended our use case to show value, and then going to government entities to sort of say, look, this is what we've been doing. Here's some evidence from what we've done. Based on this evidence, we believe that if we work together and we were to scale this, these are the benefits that the various stakeholders will realize. So it's that whole scenario of action, validation, data, and then presenting that to say, look, if we now scale this, what does this look like? And as a consequence, that we've done a number of white papers, thought leadership conferences where we've advocated this approach. So you're definitely right. It's been a hard battle, but the last few months, especially the last year, has helped accelerate that, because now people are in the mindset that the transformation from education has to move from being a compartmentalized endeavor to becoming a lifelong learning endeavor.
Okay, I mean, you also touched on the issue that Terence was talking about, which is the importance of trust, because no matter what communication you have with anybody, the receiver of that communication has to trust you. So, Terence, if I can turn to you, you've worked within the London School of Economics, London Business School, MIT. I would imagine MIT is very forward-thinking, but not all academic institutions are. How frustrating is it to be in a system that doesn't work as quickly as your students?
First of all, I love the messages from Shahzad and Dr. Ali, and it really resonates with me. And look, society has been developed over thousands of years, and many of the structures we have today have frozen in time, and they're no longer fit for purpose. They need reimagination. And so trust, for example, what is trust? It opens up new markets. It's by the way, trust travels faster through networks than hierarchies. And what I love about UAE is, they've got this rich Costa Rica-like ecosystem where ideas flow. It's a melting pot for access to capital, talent, and innovation. But yes, it can be very frustrating sometimes. And the key is to lead by example. And as Shahzad said, you have to demonstrate value. If you want to make a dent, if you want to transform, you need to be in a perpetual state of beta. That means learning, unlearning, prototyping, de-risking, and demonstrating value. And by doing that, you can make change happen. And that, I find that very exciting, not just for our generation, but for our kids' generation. I call my niece the CTO, Child Technology Officer.
Dr. Ali, what are the challenges that you and your team face day to day, and how do you develop the mindset and the resilience to be able to do things and to boldly go where no one has ever gone before? I think somebody else has used that line.
Right. So thank you for the question. Actually, there is a saying that says, a smooth sea never makes a good sailor. So if you are not facing challenge, you will eventually fail because the challenge is too big for you. So for us, the first challenge, and probably the one that almost broke us, was a challenge that we developed a product that was ready, but there was no market for it, no market fit for it, right? And we're kind of losing relevance at that time, to the point that my co-founder saw no potential in it and decided to give up. And that was the time where I was just starting with MBRI, Mohammed bin Rashid Innovation Fund. So we're joining just the second incubator, and we're trying to move it to the next stage, make a revenue out of it, and see what are the potential out of it, right? So this was the first challenge that we're facing, and I discussed with them. We came up with two solutions. Either we continue to the same line and we seek outside countries, outside markets, or we try to diversify, or we try to pivot to other markets, to other areas of interest. So we looked at both of them, we analyzed them, we did matrices and all of these things, and we came up to the conclusion that, okay, the other areas can benefit much more, at least and will have more impact. So this was the first case of challenge, and our first went through it. Later stages, of course, trying to convince entities that this is the best choice for you is probably one of the hardest. So what we did for that, for example, is we gave them an access to our platform, and we showed them a comparison of how are you doing it versus how we are doing it. And I think one area that definitely helped us on this was the lockdown. So one of the examples of this is we are doing remote monitoring of different districts, right? So we can monitor everything that is changing across the entire UAE and the region, right? And if you are not allowed to go out because of the lockdown, then you need a different way of looking at it. So at that particular time, we saw there was massive interest on this, and later, as they saw the benefit of this, they eventually continued to work with us on this.
Can I pick you up on something about the Innovation Fund, where your business was really on the verge of collapse, but you were talking to the Innovation Fund? It sounds to me as though you were having partnership type conversations rather than them just being a source of funding.
Well, the incubator that we were in was kind of both. We're mostly in, how do I express it? Like they would help us. It was more of a mentorship and guidance than a typical partnership. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it is financed by Ministry of Finance here. So they are helping startups grow and see what are the opportunities for them. So they connect us with different entities to see what are the potential. they would sit us and help us in a business. How do we develop our business case? I come from a technical background, so many of this was new to me, and I'm thankful for their role in our journey and how did they help us in this.
So what do you think a fund like this can do to help create an innovation culture within the UAE for organizations like yours who have got growing pains and all sorts of other pains, as you very candidly shared just now? I mean, what sort of contribution does it make?
Well, I think the role, at least for us, was really critical. As I told, we are on the verge of losing relevance and probably closing the startup at one point. I actually almost gave up twice during, or probably before that time. I cannot give up while they are mentoring me, right? So I gave up probably twice before that, but then with their help, I think it changed our mindset. We could see more potential in the work. We could see that, okay, if this area does not work, then we can go to other areas. So their role was critical, and I believe having them establish more incubators, probably collaborating with universities, innovation hubs would definitely be helpful, because this is where the innovation comes from.
So can I thank you for being so candid? I mean, it's quite interesting. You hear all the success stories all the time, and everybody does everything right every time, when in fact the real world isn't like that. So if there are people watching who are going through similar things, they are not alone, and that can be a very encouraging and a very inspiring message to hear. There is a question that was submitted, which sort of touches on what you've just been talking about. But what is the role of the public sector in innovating entrepreneurship and promoting corporate governance amidst an outsurge of something like the coronavirus? Do you have a comment on that?
Well, not much actually, but from one side, for the coronavirus, of course, most of the funds went to that particular region. So we had lack of funding even for the project that the government were seeking. From the other side, the government had to be more efficient. And so looking for innovative startup was kind of ideal in this situation, because you can reduce the cost, reduce and focus elsewhere for this.
Okay, Shazad, I know you said that you weren't going to, mention the pandemic, but it was in the question there. What are your comments on this?
So I think are you asking from a personal point of view, or more than
from a personal and a business perspective?
Yeah. So I think I'm going to use the words of Dickens. It's been the best of times and the worst of times. It's been the best of times for us personally, in the sense that it's given us, it's validated what we've been working on. So for us, it hasn't been a pivot or it's opened up anything for us. It's just simply validated what we've been saying for a period of time, where education and its delivery is digitally broken. So that's been great for us for that reason. And so the people we've been having conversations where previously they might have thought we were like a nice to have or sort of thing. It's now that there's an immediacy of need. So I think that it's been positive in that regard. There are some negatives as well that we have to kind of recognize. And that is that, to change human behavior, but also to change public sector behavior to an extent, right? That's going to take a period of time, right? And for some of us who were involved in, corporate transformations like myself, I did it at Pearson in London, and I also did Barclays as a bank. So, if you try to transform a bank, you know how difficult that is in 2015. But what is interesting there is that it's really the kind of things, as people who listen to Terence and others, is how do you transition and shift kind of mindset and behaviors, right? And that's the hard part, really. It's how long it takes to then, when the dirham drops, in the sense that you recognize that the change needs to happen, what is the veracity and the velocity of that change? So I think it's really, you've got to be patient in that process. So right now, people know that things need to happen differently. It's just making sure that we don't fall back to how things were. It's like, for example, on a very personal level, as in for everyone, a lot of us miss flying, for example, because we can't travel to certain places because of lockdown and things. And as a consequence of that, we became much more appreciative of relationships, as in people, our family, our friends, etc., etc. And then the really interesting is that if you fast forward 2 years' time and we're then traveling again as we did before, are we going to still be conscious of remembering the time, or actually we need to be grateful that we've got this blessing again, or do we revert back to normal human behavior, which is just to kind of do that? So I think here there's a change that needs to happen, but it's just being patient in addressing that change, and Lives of Terrence and others are helping the dialogue to sort of say, look, we have an opportunity, as all those in the kind of innovation is, we're basically second half of the chessboard. I'm sure you're all familiar with the analogy. There was a wise guy, and he played chess with one of the rulers, and every time he made a move, it would obviously it would double, and by the time you get to the other half of the chessboard, you accelerate. And so we're in that scenario where tech is eating the world, but it's really understanding how do we appropriate that in the most appropriate way.
But it's interesting that you make the comment about relationships. I mean, so really this is about the marriage of technology, innovation, and humanity, and bringing humanness back into
exactly. And like, those of you might be familiar with, if you look at Postman, when he wrote about technopoly. So Neil Postman wrote a famous book, and he coined this term technopoly in the 70s. And if you look in the English dictionary now, what does technopoly mean? And it said there to surrender culture to technology, right? It's a fascinating point. You said it then, let alone if you do the analysis now. So I think really what it's really about, and when we're developing our app, we have basically 3 components of how we do stuff. And it's basically, first, it's about the data part of what data we're capturing. Then it's obviously the science part, so what elements of machine learning are we using to analyze that data and do stuff with it. But we have a third component, which we defined in 2016, by the way, right? Data plus science plus human expertise. So, machines are great at, analyzing lots of information, but generally speaking, they make bad judgments. I know they're improving, and obviously the AI tool that, the thing. And for example, I had a classic example of that when somebody emailed me about 2 years ago who were using that tool, and they booked in something that was a public holiday, for example, right, in the country. So there's always going to be mistakes, but a human would have, in most cases, known that was a public holiday, for example. So I think the human element and the trust element is extremely important now, and we see it from a brand point of view as well. Is how are we building up that trust? And in a world where we're losing attention, brand provenance and affinity is less than it always used to be. So it's how do we address that?
Okay, so what do you think that the work that both of you are doing and other innovators like you are actually going to be bringing to society? Dr. Ali, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, our work is directly, I think, is more relevant to the government itself and the entity themselves, but the impact on society is nevertheless important in this case. I think from a personal view, I hope that the startup that we are working on would create a disruption and would create passion for others to follow suit. So that's one side, at least from personal perspective. From a governmental point and society point of view, I think if we are, like for example, one of the areas that we are working on is agriculture. I'm still trying to stay on that line, so we are still keeping that project running. But one of the areas, which is agriculture, the aim of that product was to test why is the plant behaving in a certain way, right? So let's say you have a farm and you are getting a certain yield coming out of it, right? And then we analyze that area continuously every single day to look for weaknesses area, right? So if we figure out that, okay, maybe in the middle of the farm there is a weakness, we analyze everything that is related to that area that can cause the weakness. So we analyze the soil moisture, we analyze the soil content, we analyze the weather condition, we analyze the nitrogen content, the chlorophyll content, everything that is related to the farm, right? So in this case, the farmer is able to look at the case, there is a weakness here, and come up and say, okay, we have a reason for that, right?
So this is exactly what Dagdetta was talking about in part 1 earlier on, about the Mars Hope probe, where it was all about data. Terence, can I ask you to give an overview really of where do you think that the technology and an innovative culture can take the UAE in the future? Because some great examples here.
It's a really important question that I think we all need to be asking and thinking about. Most organizations have a business strategy, but many don't have an innovation strategy. And so that's a key opportunity. And I think it comes back to this word vitality and being more alive and harnessing the full potential of your citizens. So that what I call high ROI, return on intelligence and return on imagination. And look, we're at this exciting inflection point. There's many risks on the planet confronting every country, including UAE. For example, climate risk is investment risk. I think sustainability, the green revolution. There's all sorts of challenges around the planet that create opportunity for innovators. And the key message is don't fall in love with an idea, fall in love with a pain point. And there's so much untapped value to unlock, untapped value in society, in our enterprises, in our environment. So this is where the magic lies. And for me, that gives me great optimism for the UAE in terms of creating this ecosystem that really fast tracks great talent and great solutions to big problems. And by the way, big problems attract big thinkers.
Okay, Terence, thank you very much indeed. Shazad and Dr. Ali, thank you so much for joining us today. Fascinating to hear how you're dealing with things on a day-to-day, but at the same time accelerating with innovation into the future. So thank you very much indeed for that. It's occurred to me that when I was at the BBC many, many years ago, an organization not renowned for being very fast, I had a philosophy which was I never asked for permission, I just asked for forgiveness. And it worked well for me for a while, but not completely. But gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today and for sharing your stories. It's been really great. So thank you very much. So let's move on to our final part of this program. There is a third program that you're invited to take part in as well in a few minutes' time. As we've heard so far today, the government and the Ministry of Finance in particular have been doing as much as they can to plan for a successful and sustainable future for the UAE. The UAE and so many other countries around the world have a very high proportion of young people, as I mentioned, many of whom have got huge hope for the future. And I don't think the Mars probe was named Hope by mistake. Young people, you may be one, hugely energetic, ambitious, and very often want to challenge the way that things were and crave opportunities and have a huge role to play in the future of the UAE. So in the next session, we'll explore in more detail what is being done to make the UAE a place where young people can be successful in the future. And the moderator for that session is Zara Ali Al-Jawi, who's the head of building financial accounting capabilities at the Ministry of Finance. That's all from me. I hope that I've helped to stimulate your thinking with the questions that I've been asking everybody today. That's all from me, but stay tuned for our next session. Thank you very much.
أهلا وسهلا مجددا، نرحب بكم أفضل ترحيب ونشكر لكم حضوركم ومشاركتكم في جلستنا الثالثة لهذا اليوم. طبعا الحياة مليئة بالمنعطفات والمتغيرات والتحولات الغير متوقعة الناتجة عن التحديات المالية والتي لها الأثر الكبير على حياتنا واستقرارنا سواء كأسر أو كأفراد في هذا المجتمع. أصبح اليوم من الضروري الاهتمام بجانب جدا مهم وهو جانب التثقيف المالي لكافة فئات المجتمع، وأيضا تنشئة جيل واع ماليا يقوم بإدارة أمواله بالطريقة الصحيحة وعلى النحو الصحيح. أصبح اليوم سلوك الفرد الصحيح ووضع خطط جادة للتوفير والادخار يساهم بصورة فعالة في تجاوز العقبات والتحديات سواء المتوقعة منها أو الغير متوقعة. إن دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة تملك مستوى مرتفع لجودة الحياة، ويعود ذلك بسبب الرخاء الاقتصادي الناتج من القيادة الحكيمة لدولة الإمارات، وأيضا مستوى الإدارة الحكومية الجيدة التي حرصت قيادة الدولة على تطبيقها في كافة المجالات وكافة القطاعات. ومن هذا المنطلق وسعينا الدائم إلى تعزيز التخطيط المالي السليم، وأيضا أهمية التوفير وتوجيه فئة الشباب بالتحديد للتحكم بالإرادة وضوابط الادخار بهدف تحقيق حياة سهلة ومرنة تمكنهم من توجيه كافة طاقاتهم لما يضمن لهم مستقبل آمن ومشرق. قبل أن نبدأ في جلستنا اليوم، أود تعريف الحضور الكريم بمصطلح الادخار بشكل مبسط. يعرف بالادخار بناء على الكتيب الصادر من صندوق النقد. الادخار بشكل مبسط هو نسبة أو اقتطاع نسبة أو جزء محدد من الدخل، سواء الدخل الشهري أو الدخل اليومي، لكن دون إنفاقه لفترة زمنية معينة قد تعود إلى سنوات. والآن نبدأ جلستنا الحوارية اليوم بعنوان الشباب ومبادئ الادخار، في حوار بناء، وذلك من خلال تسليط الضوء على أهمية الادخار وما هي تحدياتها بالنسبة لفئة الشباب. نستضيف اليوم ونرحب في جلستنا سعادة يونس حاجي الخوري، وكيل وزارة المالية، والدكتورة هبة عبد المنعم، رئيس قسم الدراسات والإحصائيات في صندوق النقد العربي، والدكتور سهل روسان، خبير اقتصادي في وزارة المالية. سعادة يونس حاجي الخوري، نبدأ جلستنا سعادتكم معكم. من خلال خبراتكم المتراكمة وقيادتكم في المجال المالي، ما هي برأيكم ثقافة الادخار المناسبة والمستهدفة لفئة الشباب؟ وما هي نصائحكم لتوعيتهم بأهمية الادخار؟
السلام عليكم مرة ثانية. رحب فيكم في الجلسة، وأشكر الأخت زهرة وفريق شباب وزارة المالية على إعداد الجلسة الخاصة بالادخار. أيضا لا يفوتني أني أشكر الدكتورة ممثلة صندوق النقد العربي والصندوق نفسه على الاستبيان وأهمية الادخار وأهمية توفر الثروة لدى الجميع حتى يستطيع أن يعيش الحياة الطبيعية. فاليوم نتكلم على موضوع مهم جدا، ألا وهو موضوع كيفية تغيير ثقافة الفرد من أن يعتمد على نفسه ويكون حياته ويكون مستقبله بدون الاعتماد على الآخرين، ألا وهي ثقافة الادخار. فالادخار هو عنصر أساسي لاحتفاظ الإنسان بجزء من ما يكتسبه للوقت الحاجة في المستقبل. فالادخار عنصر أساسي أيضا يساهم في تطوير وتحسين الدورة الاقتصادية، ويسهم في تعزيز النشاطات الإنتاجية للاقتصاد. وكما تعلمنا يعني في ثقافتنا بأننا نحن دائما يعني نخبئ القرش الأبيض لليوم الأسود. وكما تعلمنا من سيدنا عمر رضي الله عنه حينما يعني وجه بفقرة مهمة جدا، ألا وهي فقرة أو كلما اشتهيت اشتريت. فبالتالي اليوم أصبحت ثقافة الادخار مادة تدرس، وأصبحت سياسة دول قبل أن يكون الادخار ثقافة أفراد. والادخار من أهم عناصر الاستقلال المالي، والذي يساعد على تحقيق الحياة الخالية من الضغوط والتوتر. ولا يمكن أن ندعي أن ثقافة الادخار حاضرة في العقلية العربية، ولا أن في أي ضعف للادخار ناتج من عدم معرفة الكيفية المناسبة. اليوم في عالمنا المعاصر نرى الكثير من القروض الشخصية اللي أصبحت يعني أهم المجالات اللي تعتمد عليها أرباح المؤسسات المصرفية كدخل رئيسي للتضخيم أرباحها وأيضا لنمو أعمالها. ولكن الإنسان هو اللي لازم يعني يقرر ويتخذ القرار. قد في كثير من الأوقات يكون قرار صعب، ألا وهو نوع الاقتراض. فدائما الاقتراض اللي هو مرتبط بالاستقرار الأسري، وهو القرار الاقتراض لبناء البيت الأول أو لشراء البيت الأول، هو القرار الأفضل. وعلى الإنسان أن ما يتوسع في الأنواع المختلفة من القروض اللي موجودة، سواء كانت قروض استهلاكية أو كانت قروض من خلال الصرف، من خلال الأدوات الأخرى مثل الكريدت كارت أو غيرها. والحمد لله في دولنا العربية نرى دائما المرأة العربية لها القدرة في مساعدة المجتمع ودعم ثقافة التوفير ودعم الاقتصاد للمستقبل. وهناك أيضا يعني أدوار الحكومات تلعب فيها في الادخار. فإذا الحكومة شافت أن في فوائد مالية، هناك الكثير من الأدوات اللي قد تكون موجودة لامتصاص الفوائد المالية. وأيضا يعني الكثير من الحكومات تفرض أنواع معينة من الضرائب اللي هي ضرائب انتقائية تكون على السلع الفارغة أو غير ضرورية لتخفيض الاستهلاك. اليوم الادخار أصبح كأي رياضة أو أصبح كأي برنامج الإنسان يعني يتميز في غالبية الناس، ولا يتأثرون بكثير من اللي قد يسمونهم أو يدعون أنهم فئة ما يسمى بالناس البخيلين أو غيرهم. فهؤلاء المثبطين لازم أنهم ما يأثرون على فئة الشباب. وهناك يعني الكثير من الطرق من الادخار. الادخار ضروري جدا يكون بشكل منتظم، ولا تخالف عادات صرف الأصدقاء، ولا أن الإنسان يتأثر باللي حواليه. فيجب البدء بتغيير الفكر ونمط الحياة. فبدل ما الإنسان يعني يصرف على المطاعم وغيرها، يبتدي يصرف على الأدوات العلمية من الكتب والمجلات العلمية. وبدل ما الاشتراك في القنوات الفضائية، يبدأ يشترك في القنوات اللي تساعد في تطوير الذات من خلال الدورات ومن خلال المقابلات الشخصية مع الخبراء اللي موجودين اليوم في كثير من قنوات التواصل الاجتماعي. في مثال يعني جدا مهم اليوم، على ما يزيد على 30 سنة شفنا دولتين، أكبر دولتين اقتصاديات في العالم، أمريكا والصين. قبل 30 سنة مستوى المدخلات أو مدخرات الأسر في الصين والولايات المتحدة كانت متساوية جدا. ولكن في 2007 شفنا ارتفاع مدخرات الأسر الصينية إلى 30%، في حين في الولايات المتحدة المدخرات لم تتجاوز 2%. وهذا كله يعني كان بسبب الفرق في ثقافة الاستهلاك ولا تطور سوق الائتمان. ففي أزمتين متتاليات، أزمة 2008 و2020، شفنا كيف الأسر في الولايات المتحدة، لأن نسبة ديون الأسر إلى الناتج المحلي كانت في حدود 85%. ولكن الكثير من الأسر شافت نفسها أنها يعني ما أصبحت تستطيع تستهلك أو تصرف من مدخراتها لعدم توفرها. فبالتالي تسببت في كثير من المشاكل الأسرية وغيرها، في حين لم نرى ذلك في جمهورية الصين. فعلينا يعني من اليوم رايح اللي ما عنده يعني نظام ادخاري يبتدي بفتح حساب مصرفي، يحول شهريا، يلغي بطاقات الائتمان إلا للضروريات. وأيضا يعني يجب مراجعة مصروفاتنا الشهرية، مثل ما قلنا في السابق، نمتنع عن القروض ما عدا قرض السكن، ولا تذهب إلى السوبر ماركت مثل ما قالوا أنت يعني يوعان، ولا تبتدي في مشترياتك من أول نظرة، ولكن حاول أنك تتسوق وتتجول حتى تحصل على أفضل الأسعار. فهناك يعني دائما المثل اللي يقول لو وفرت يعني كوب قهوة يوميا فأنت تقريبا وفرت على 10 سنوات ما يزيد على 12,000 درهم. فموازنتك الشهرية هي الأمور الأساسية اللي لابد أنك تتحلى فيها، وتستوعب كيفية يعني وضع موازنة مالية للمصروفات، وكيفية يعني التوازن بين الصرف والمدخرات. ومثل ما يعني الكثير من أصحاب العصاميين الأغنياء العصاميين اليوم كلهم يعني تكلموا في نقطة أساسية، ألا وهي نقطة الادخار. ويجب الاستقطاع الشهري بغض النظر عن دخلك الشهري أو عن صرفك الشهري. فهناك الكثير من التجارب الجميلة والأفكار الجميلة اللي ممكن تستفيد من الكثير من قنوات التواصل. فالمعنيين على البرنامج اليوم أيضا وضعوا الكثير من الأفكار اللي ممكن الكل يستفيد فيها، بالأخص فئة الشباب، في حال رغبة في التوسع في الطرح من خلال زيارتكم لموقع وزارة المالية. وفي الختام يعني أشكركم على وقتكم وعلى حضوركم، وأترك المجال الآن للدكتورة هبة وللدكتور سهل على شرح الموضوع بشكل أكثر استفاضة. وشكرا مرة ثانية.
شكرا سعادة الوكيل. ننتقل الآن إلى المحور التالي مع الدكتورة هبة عبد المنعم. فلو أعرفكم على الدكتورة هبة. الدكتورة هبة هي رئيسة قسم الدراسات والإحصاء في صندوق النقد العربي. عملت بمجلس الوزراء المصري في مناصب مختلفة. حاصلة على شهادة الدكتوراه في الاقتصاد في مجال الاقتصاد الكلي والسياسة النقدية، وأيضا درجة الماجستير في الاقتصاد الدولي. دكتورة هبة، نرحب بكم مرة أخرى. دكتورة، لكم العديد من الإسهامات والبحوث المنشورة في عدد من المجالات الاقتصادية. حدثينا اليوم بما يتعلق بمعادلات الادخار. ما هي معادلات الادخار؟ وما هو دور التقنيات المالية الحديثة في تعزيز الادخار؟ تفضلي دكتورة.
شكرا جزيلا أخت زهرة. وفي البداية صندوق النقد العربي بيشرفه وبيسعده أن هو يتوجه بالشكر إلى وزارة المالية في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة، دولة مقر صندوق النقد العربي. وطبعا بيتوجه بالشكر إلى سعادة وكيل الوزارة سعادة يونس خوري، وإلى كل الزملاء الأفاضل في وزارة المالية على هذه المبادرة الكريمة بتنظيم هذه الفعالية التي هي على قدر كبير جدا من الأهمية بالنسبة لفئة الشباب. وزي حضرتك ما أشرتي وزي سعادة الوكيل ما أشار، طبعا الادخار بيلعب دور مهم جدا في رقي المجتمعات وفي زيادة معدلات نمو الناتج المحلي الإجمالي ومستويات رفاهية الأفراد. طبعا الادخار وزي ما تم التطرق إليه هو الفارق ما بين مستويات دخل الفرد أو الأسرة أو المجتمع في لحظة زمنية معينة مقارنة بمعدلات الاستهلاك. فبالتالي كلما كانت معدلات الاستهلاك فيها نوع من أنواع الرشادة الاقتصادية، كلما كان هناك هامش أكبر لزيادة معدلات الادخار اللي بدورها بتتوجه إلى تمويل المزيد من المشروعات والاستثمارات، وبالتالي تقوم بتولية المزيد من الدخل. وده طبعا اللي الدكتور سهل مشكورا كمان سوف يتطرق إليه من خلال هذه الجلسة. وبالتالي نحن نتحدث على قدرة الفرد أو الأسرة أو المجتمع إن هو يدير قراراته الاستهلاكية بنوع من الرشادة الاقتصادية لتوفير قدر أكبر من المدخرات بتساعده على إن هو يكون في نوع من أنواع مواجهة أي تحديات طارئة قد تكون ناتجة في المستقبل أو قد يتعرض لها موازنته في المستقبل. لو جينا طبعا اتكلمنا، العديد من الدراسات اللي قام بها صندوق النقد العربي اثبتت انه سواء في الاجل القصير او في الاجل الطويل في علاقه قويه جدا ما بين وفي الاتجاهين ما بين معدلات النمو الاقتصادي وما بين معدلات نمو الادخار. فبالتالي كل ما زاد الادخار كل ده ما بيزود النمو الاقتصادي، وكل ما بيزيد النمو الاقتصادي كل ما ده معناه طبعا زياده في مستويات دخول الافراد وبالتالي قدره اكبر على تعزيز الادخار. السؤال اللي حضرتك تفضلتي بيه ما هي معدلات الادخار؟ علشان نقيس معدل الادخار بالنسبه لاي دوله او فرد او اسره، احنا ببساطه جدا بنقسم هو حاصل قسمه الادخار على مستوى الدخل المحقق خلال فتره زمنيه محدده. يعني مثلا لو افترضنا ان في شخص مستوى دخله الشهري هو 50,000 درهم، وكان كل شهر بيبقى حريص على ان هو يدخر منهم 5000 درهم، فده يبقى معناه ان معدل الادخار عنده 10%. فهذا الامر لو جينا طبقناه على مستوى دول العالم هنلاقي ان برضو احنا بنحسب كاقتصاديين معدل الادخار لاي دوله، وفي الحقيقه هو بيكون احد اهم المتغيرات الاقتصاديه اللي يمكن لاي اقتصادي النظر اليها والحكم على مدى قدره هذه الدوله على تعزيز مستويات رفاهيه الافراد اللي بتعيش داخل هذا المجتمع. لو جينا شفنا زي ما حضرتك أشرتي ما هي معدلات الادخار على مستوى دول العالم، هنلاقي إن المتوسط العالمي هو 25% بالنسبة للاقتصاد العالمي، وهذا يعني إن العالم كله بيخصص ربع الدخل الإجمالي العالمي بيخصص للادخار. طبعا هناك فروقات ما بين دول العالم المختلفة في معدلات الادخار. يعني مثلا نذكر ان اعلى دولة على مستوى العالم في معدل الادخار هي بروناي، 54% معدل الادخار، وده طبعا معدل كبير جدا، يعني معناها ان نص الدخل اللي بيتم توليده في سنة واحدة بيتم تخصيصه للادخار. ايضا عندنا الصين عندها معدل نمو كبير جدا، معدل ادخار مرتفع جدا بيصل الى 44%. ويمكن ده بياخدنا برضو كاقتصاديين الى اننا نفسر ان لماذا الصين هي واحده من اعلى دول العالم من حيث معدلات النمو. طبعا قبل ازمه جائحه كورونا كانت الصين بتنمو بمعدلات نمو سنويه تتراوح ما بين 6 إلى 7%، وده احد الاسباب ان عندها واحده من اكبر معدلات الادخار على مستوى العالم. طبعا ده بيفرق كتير، لانه زي ما احنا قلنا انه نمط الاستهلاك مختلف ما بين دوله الى اخرى. مثلا ده بالمقارنه مع دوله زي الولايات المتحده الامريكيه معدل الادخار بها لا يتعدى 19%، لان السكان في حد ذاتهم النمط الاستهلاكي عندهم بيغلب على النمط الادخاري مقارنه طبعا بدول اخرى. فبالتالي هناك فروقات ما بين دول العالم، ما بين الاقاليم الجغرافيه. على مستوى الاقاليم الجغرافيه مثلا بشكل عام دول شرق اسيا والباسيفيك عندها اعلى معدلات الادخار حوالي 35% مقارنه طبعا بمعدلات اقل. طيب الان ناتي الى المنطقه العربيه. ما هو وضع الادخار في المنطقه العربيه وفي الدول العربيه؟ وطبعا دي الدول العربيه هي محل الاهتمام الاول لصندوق النقد العربي. هنلاقي ان معدل الادخار في الدول العربيه هو 29%. بشكل عام طبعا هو اعلى نسبيا من المتوسط العالمي، ولكن الدول العربيه قد تواجهها مشكله انه القطاع المالي ليس لديه القدره الكافيه الى انه هو يتم توظيف هذه المدخرات في استثمارات تساعد على جلب المزيد من المدخرات، وده يمكن اللي احنا هنتطرق اليه في الجزء الاخر من المداخله الخاصه بها. على مستوى الدول العربيه فرادى، أعلى الدول العربية من حيث معدلات الادخار هي دولة قطر ودولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة. على سبيل المثال معدل الادخار في الإمارات هو 45%، فالحمد لله الدولة بتتمتع بواحدة من أعلى معدلات الادخار على مستوى العالم، وده طبعا بشكل كبير جدا بيرجع إلى السياسات الرشيدة اللي بتتبعها الدولة. ويمكن طبعا المعدل ده لو احنا كاقتصاديين جينا قارناه بمعدل الاستثمار في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة هنلاقي ان هو اعلى. يعني معناها ان احنا بنغطي كل فرص الاستثمار اللي داخل الدولة في موارد ادخارات تغطيها، ولكن كمان بيتبقى جزء آخر من فائض الادخار، وده طبعا إلى القيادة الحكيمة بيتم استثماره من خلال صناديق الثروة. وصناديق الثروة دي يمكن النقطة اللي بتهم الشباب زي ما حضرتك أشرتي، لأن هي بتلعب دور مهم جدا، لأن هي بتستثمر فوائد المدخرات اللي أنا على مستوى الاقتصاد المحلي ما قدرتش أستوعبها في سنة معينة، في كمان زيادة في معدلات الادخار، فبيتم استثمارها في صناديق الثروة السيادية، في استثمارات بالخارج علشان توليد المزيد من الدخل، ده لإيه؟ لصالح الأجيال الشابة المقبلة. فبالتالي دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة تتمتع بمعدلات ادخارية من أعلى المعدلات على مستوى العالم، وبيتم توظيفها على النحو الأكمل لضمان رفاهية الأجيال المقبلة. طبعا النقطة الأخرى اللي حضرتك تطرقتي إليها هو دور التقنيات المالية الحديثة. زي ما احنا أشرنا، هو الفكرة مش فقط معدل الادخار، الفكرة إنه يكون داخل الدولة في قطاع مالي على قدر كبير من الكفاءة قادر إن هو يوظف هذه المدخرات في استثمارات، وبالتالي يكون وسيط ما بين المدخرين والمستثمرين. لكن إذا ده ما حصلش بالكفاءة اللازمة، فطبعا هيبقى معدل الادخار مش هيتم توظيفه بالشكل اللي احنا أشرنا إليه. لو جينا بصينا للقطاع المالي بشكل عام في الدول العربية، هنلاقي إن هو بيسيطر عليه القطاع المصرفي اللي هو البنوك mainly بشكل عام. طيب البنوك عامة بتواجه بعض التحديات في إن هي تقدم خدمات مالية على قدر من الكفاءة بالنسبة لبعض شرائح المجتمع على الأخص. خلينا نبص دلوقتي، أنا لو عايزة أعمل أي معاملة مالية لازم هروح فرع البنك، ممكن انتظر وقت طويل علشان خاطر ان انا اخد دوري. المعامله اللي انا هنجزها دي بتتطلب الكثير من المستندات الورقيه، وبالتالي زي ما حضرتك عارفه فئه الشباب هو بالعكس نتيجه التطور التقني هو اكثر مؤهل اكثر ان هو يتعامل مع تطبيقات تقنيه، مع امور سريعه واجراءات سريعه في تنفيذ المعاملات الماليه. هنلاقي من ناحيه اخرى كمان، طيب لو بصينا فئه الشباب في الدول العربية غير مسموح لهم ان هم يفتحوا حسابات مصرفية، وبالتالي يبدأوا يأخذوا دورهم او نصيبهم من الخدمات المالية الا بداية من سن قانوني معين وهو 18 سنة. وبعض الدول العربية هذا السن القانوني كمان ممكن بيزيد عن 18 سنة، وبالتالي ففي فرصة إلى أن فئة الشباب يكونوا مستبعدين من أن هم يحصلوا على الخدمات المالية نظرا لاعتبار السن. طبعا في عدد كبير من الدول العربيه والبنوك المركزيه الصراحه كانت حريصه على انها تتجاوز هذه التحديات وتحاول انها يكون في اطر لتشجيع الشباب ان هم يفتحوا حسابات مصرفيه. من جهه اخرى كمان السكان المناطق النائيه ممكن يكون صعب عليهم ان هم يتوجهوا ويروحوا فرع البنك في منطقه او مدينه رئيسيه، وبالتالي يكونوا محرومين من الخدمات الماليه. المشروعات الصغيره والمتوسطه، علشان خاطر لو انا شاب وبعمل مشروع صغير ومتوسط هيكون صعب عليا الحصول على قرض لان انا ما عنديش الضمانات الكافيه. وبالتالي من مجمل هذه التحديات ومع التطور التقني ظهر دور التقنيات الماليه الحديثه. التقنيات الماليه الحديثه لو حبينا نعرفها هي عباره عن ايه؟ هي عباره عن الاستفاده من التطور التقني في تقديم خدمات ماليه مبتكره بتساعد على زياده كفاءه الخدمات الماليه. زياده الكفاءه بنعني بيها ايه؟ بنعني الى اننا نسرع من وقت انجاز المعامله، نقلل من تكلفتها، ونخليها مناسبه اكتر للشخص المتلقي للخدمات الماليه. وبالتالي ظهرت التقنيات الماليه الحديثه. حاليا السوق على مستوى العالم حوالي 136 مليار دولار، بتنمو بمعدل نمو سنوي مركب حوالي 36%. الدول العربيه في اهتمام كبير جدا بيها. طبعا انتوا كلنا عايشين حياتنا اليوميه، عندنا على الموبايل في ابس فيها فرع البنك، بنقدر في لحظه اننا نحول من حساب لحساب، او بنقدر اننا نعمل مدفوعات عبر الحدود او داخل الدوله. كل ذلك هو بينصب في بوتقه اسمها التقنيات الماليه الحديثه. الآن النقطة الأخيرة اللي حضرتك تفضلتي بيها هو ما هو دور التقنيات المالية الحديثة في تشجيع الادخار. طبعا التقنيات دي هي بتتنوع ويعني بتفي بعدد كبير جدا من احتياجات الافراد. هي بتمكننا كافراد الى اننا ندير اموالنا بشكل اكثر كفاءه، ده من جهه، وبالتالي بتسمح لنا اكثر بزياده المساحه المخصصه للادخار. من ناحيه اخرى هي بتعرفنا احنا كممكن بعض الشباب اللي ما عندهمش الخبره بالنواحي الاستثماريه بتقدم لهم افضل فرص الاستثمار. زي ايه على سبيل المثال؟ هنلاقي اننا عندنا احد تطبيقات التقنيات الماليه اسمها روبو ادفايزر. يعني معناها دي اللي هي المستشار الآلي. المستشار الآلي ده هو عبارة عن تطبيق على الهاتف أو على شبكة الإنترنت، هو بيمكن الأفراد إلى إن هم يديروا مدخراتهم بشكل أكثر كفاءة. على سبيل المثال هو مستخدم في المملكة العربية السعودية في الاستثمار في البورصة، بمعنى إن أنا كمستثمر بدخل من خلال التطبيق بحدد مستوى المخاطر اللي أنا أقدر أقبله. يعني أنا ممكن أقبل على مستوى معين من مدخراتي معدل للمخاطر محدد، او غيري ممكن يقبل مخاطر اقل. ففي مستويات المخاطر اما مرتفعه او منخفضه او متوسطه، بناء عليها هو بيقدر يقول لي انت ممكن الفلوس دي تتحط انها تستثمر في الاوجه الاستثمار الفلاني، سواء مثلا على صعيد الاستثمار في البورصه بيبقى مفروض في محفظه. المحفظه هو بيدي اختيارات على المستثمر الشاب، بيقول له ان انت لو حبيت انك تحقق معدل مثلا لفايده كذا في المية، هيكون قدامك انك تستثمر مثلا سواء في ودائع او في اسهم او هكذا. ففي عدد كبير من التطبيقات اللي بتساعد الشباب ان هم يديروا مدخراتهم بشكل اكثر فعاليه. التطبيق الاخر من تطبيقات التقنيات الماليه الحديثه هو طبعا تطبيق جديد اسمه الكراود فاندنج او منصات التمويل الجماعي، وهي في الحقيقه موجوده في دوله الامارات العربيه المتحده، ودوله الامارات العربيه المتحده من اهم الدول العربيه في تطور هذه التقنيات. وهي ببساطه بتكون منصه على شبكه الانترنت، انا بدخل على المنصه وبشوف المشروعات الاستثماريه اللي مطروحه من عدد من المستثمرين. ممكن امول شركه او ممكن امول برودكت معين لشركه، وبيكون قدامي دراسه جدوى، بيكون قدامي هذا المنتج، التوقعات الخاصه بالمبيعات الخاصه به. وطبعا هذه المنصات بتكون تحت اشراف كامل من السلطات الرقابيه. ففي دوله الامارات العربيه في منصه اسمها بيهيف، المنصه دي بتوفر هذا الامر، وبالتالي انا حتى كميه الادخار نفسه او القدر الادخار هو بالضروره ممكن يكون صغير بنسبه المستثمرين الشباب. يعني مش بالضروره ان انا علشان ادخر مثلا زي السندات الحكوميه ممكن يكون مبالغ كبيره، لا انا ممكن بحط المبلغ اللي انا اقدر استثمر فيه في هذه الشركه او في هذا المنتج. طبعا اضافه لكده في كمان عدد من التطبيقات الاخرى اللي بيكون هدفها الفاينانشال مانجمنت، يعني الاداره الماليه. انا مثلا كشخص خلال الشهر بيكون عندي في فواتير بدفعها، في التزامات المفترض ان انا بسددها كل شهر، وبالتالي المفترض ان الاداره الكفء او مواعيد سداد هذه الفواتير والفوائد اللي بتتوفر الي بيكون في بعض التطبيقات اللي بتساعدني وبتقول لي لو انا عايزه ادخر قدر كذا من دخلي اعمل ايه بالنسبه لمجالات الاستهلاك الاخرى اللي انا ممكن اكون كنمط استهلاكي. وبالتالي هناك العديد من التطبيقات التقنيات الماليه الحديثه اللي بتساعد الافراد على ان هم يزودوا مستويات دخولهم. طبعا في المجمل انا بس عايزه اشير لنقطه مهمه، لانه في صندوق النقد العربي في حرص كبير جدا على تشجيع صناعه التقنيات الماليه الحديثه في الدول العربيه، ولذلك تم انشاء مجموعه عمل في عام 2018 هي هدفها الاساسي هو مساعده جهود الدول العربيه لتشجيع التقنيات الماليه الحديثه، ولا سيما في تقديم الخدمات الماليه للشباب وللمشروعات الصغيره والمتوسطه وللاناث ايضا. كذلك طبعا حريصين في الفتره الاخيره على انه يكون في توعيه لفئه الشباب، وبالتالي بدانا في اصدار كتيبات تعريفيه زي الكتيب اللي حضرتك تفضلتي مشكوره بالاشاره ليه. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا دكتورة هبة. دكتورة بالفعل مثل ما تكلمتي، طبعا التقنيات الحديثة وكون دولة الإمارات إحدى الدول الرائدة في مواكبة التطورات والتقنيات الحديثة والتكنولوجيا، وبالتحديد فئة الشباب هي دائما يعني فئة الشباب تنظر للتكنولوجيز أو التكنولوجيا أو حتى وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي أو التطبيقات الذكية نظرة مختلفة. ودائما أيضا حتى المناهج الحالية دائما تدعو الشباب إلى أنهم يكونون ملمين بالتقنيات الحديثة في الدولة، وهذا يمكن التركيز الرئيسي في جلستنا، أن يكون نشجع الشباب على استخدام التقنيات الحديثة اللي ممكن تساعدهم في عملية الادخار. دكتورة، في بعض الأسئلة واردة من الحضور الكريم. طبعا في سؤال، شخص عمره تقريبا 42 سنة واعتاد على الصرف العالي كنمط يعني ويستمتع بالصرف، طبعا هذا موضوع متعلق بالسعادة الشخصية للشخص نفسه. فما هي نصيحتك دكتورة أو دكتور سهل أيضا، شو هي نصيحتكم للموظف أو الشخص عفوا؟
تمام، شكرا جزيلا لسؤال حضرتك. ويمكن ده في علم الاقتصاد حاجه اسمها behavior economics، وهو اللي هو النظريه السلوكيه، وطبعا هي على قدر كبير جدا من الاهميه في تفسير القرارات الاقتصاديه. يمكن اللي دارسين اقتصاد هيعرفوا ان المفترض انه الاقتصاد بيقوم على الرشاده الاقتصاديه، لكن النظريات السلوكيه بتفترض شيء اخر مختلف، وهي بتاكد زي ما حضرتك قلتي لان الافراد سلوكهم مختلف. الرشاده الاقتصاديه زي الاخ الفاضل اللي اشار الى انه هذا الامر بيعمل له ساتسفاكشن بشكل معين، بس من ناحيه اخرى هو لو جينا فكرنا فيها لانه الاستهلاك في حد ذاته هو ما فيش فيه استدامه من ناحيه الدخل. يعني لو فكرنا ان انا ال 50,000 درهم انا صرفتهم، فانا كده بفكر ان انا دخلي هيفضل هو ال 50,000، بس في المقابل لو انا تم ادخار جزء من ال 50,000 انا هيسمح لي بالمزيد من الاستهلاك في المستقبل والمزيد من الادخار ايضا. فبالتالي احنا حتى لو فكرنا فيها من ناحيه انه شخص بيفكر الى انه قراراته بالنسبه للاستهلاك مقابل الادخار، ما هو كمان الادخار هيسمح بقدر اكبر من زياده الدخل في المستقبل، وبالتالي امكانيات اكبر بالنسبه للفرد بشكل عام. بس الاهم من ذلك انا في وجهه نظري كاقتصادي باكد على اهميه الرشاده الاقتصاديه، لانه لسبب طبعا يا رب ان شاء الله كلنا يكون عندنا قدره ان يكون عندنا نفس مستويات الدخول، لكن ما حدش ابدا فينا الا تعرض لتاثيرات جائحه فيروس كورونا وشفنا تاثيراتها على العالم اجمع. فبالتالي الدخل اللي ما بين ايدينا دلوقتي احنا مطالبين باننا نتعامل فيه بقدر من الرشاده، ولازم اننا يكون دايما عندنا نظره للمستقبل. وخلينا ناخد ده المثال لينا هو المثال القياده الحكيمه لدوله الامارات العربيه المتحده. اذا لم تكن الدوله منذ سنوات عندها هذه النظره ما كان يكون في رفاهيه للمجتمع بهذا الشكل. شكرا.
شكرا دكتورة هبة، مشكورة طبعا دكتورة. حظينا اليوم بكم من المعلومات القيمة واللي تعزز من ثقافة الادخار لدى الحضور وتحديدا بالنسبة لفئة الشباب. ننتقل الآن إلى المحور التالي مع الدكتور سهل رسان. طبعا الدكتور سهل هو خبير اقتصادي في وزارة المالية. دكتور سهل، طبعا ناقشنا في الجلسة طبعا الادخار هو اقتطاع جزء من الدخل بنسبة محددة، والاستثمار هو توظيف تلك الأموال المدخرة طبعا للحصول على دخل إضافي. فدكتور ممكن توضح شو العلاقة بين الاستثمار وبين الدخل بين الاستثمار والادخار، وهل يربطهما عامل زمني؟ تفضل دكتور.
شكرا لك أخت زهرة. طبعا بالتأكيد أنا يعني بدي أبدأ من المستوى الاقتصادي الكلي وأتكلم شوي عن البعد الثقافي، وبعدين ننزل على المستوى الجزئي ومستوى الأفراد. طبعا مثل ما أنتم عارفين في عندنا إحنا دورة اقتصادية وفي عندنا نموذج دائري لتدفق الدخل. عشان هيك يعني إحنا لما نتكلم عن الادخار دائما يعني بالأخص لما نكون موجهين كلامنا لفئة الشباب، يعني النظرة السائدة انه فقط على المستوى الفردي. طبعا لا، بالتاكيد هو في النموذج الدائري لتدفق الدخل في الاقتصاد، اذا ما في عندنا مدخرات اساسا ما في عندنا استثمار. يعني واحده من المكونات الرئيسيه للاقتصاد اللي هي الافراد والقطاع العائلي. هاي الافراد هذول الافراد والقطاع العائلي لما يدخروا طبعا بدهم يدخروا في البنوك والمؤسسات الماليه. طبعا هذا هو الادخار المنتج، لانه اذا كان كنز مثلا ادخرناه في البيوت اللي هو هوردنج طبعا ما بدخل في الدوره الاقتصاديه وما بدخل في الدوره الانتاجيه، والمستثمرين ما بيستفيدوا منه، لانه البنوك والمؤسسات الماليه تشتغل زي ماتش ميكر بين الناس اللي عندهم مدخرات لكن ما في عندهم بزنس ايدياز والناس اللي عندهم بزنس ايدياز لكن ما عندهم مدخرات. فالبنوك تعمل عباره عن ماتش ميكر بين الفئتين هذول. فالافراد والقطاع العائلي لما يدخروا ويحطوا هاي المدخرات في البنوك والاسواق الماليه، بيجوا المنتجين والمستثمرين بيستخدموا هذه الاموال المدخره وبضخوها في القطاع الانتاجي. الان القطاع الانتاجي هذا بده يتمخض عنه اجور، بده يتمخض عنه ريع، فوائد، ارباح، اللي هي طبعا مكونات الدخل القومي بدها تروح كمان مره لمين؟ طبعا هون ما بتكلم عن كل مكونات النموذج لانه في عندنا الحكومه وفي عندنا القطاع الخارجي، انا بتكلم فقط هون عن قطاع الافراد والقطاع العائلي. هذه الاجور والريع والفوائد والارباح بدها تروح كمان مره على شكل دخل لمين؟ للافراد والقطاع العائلي، وتستمر الدوره الاقتصاديه بهذه الطريقه. اذا بدون الادخار ما في استثمار، وبدون الاستثمار ما بصير في عندنا احنا تراكم راس مالي اللي هو ببساطه شديده بيعكس زياده قدره الاقتصاد على الانتاج، زيادة الطاقة الإنتاجية في الاقتصاد. إذا يعني بدون ادخار ما فيش استثمار، بدون استثمار ما فيش تراكم رأس مالي، بدون تراكم رأس مالي ما فيش نمو اقتصادي. فالموضوع إذا يعني مش بس هو على المستوى الجزئي وعلى مستوى الأفراد، إحنا سلوكنا بالنسبة للادخار بيحدد أيضا مستوى الادخار على الادخار على المستوى الوطني الناشونال سيفنج، وبالتالي بيحدد ايضا مستويات الاستثمار والنمو الاقتصادي وزياده الطاقه الانتاجيه. اللي تفضلت فيه الدكتوره هبه يعني كلام جميل جدا. البعد الثقافي بعد مهم جدا في موضوع الادخار. طبعا هذا يعني بنتج عن فهم الانسان للحياه، عن ترتيب القيم، شو اهميه الاستهلاك في حياته، لانه صار في عندنا احنا نزعه في العصر الحديث اللي هي الكونسيومرزم، انه مفهوم السعاده صار في استهلاك اكبر قدر من الاشياء الماديه. تمام؟ فاللي بصير مثلا انه بعض الشعوب الشرقيه المتحفظه على سبيل المثال مثل ما تفضلت الدكتوره في عندهم مدخرات عاليه. يعني مثلا متوقع بالصين في هذه بنهايه 2021 انه يكون تقريبا 34% معدل الادخار الاسر بالنسبه للهاوس هولدز. الهند ايضا نسبيا النسبه مرتفعه تقريبا 21.4 كانت في 2020. الولايات المتحده في بعض السنوات نزلت يمكن بحدود اذا ما خانتني الذاكره يعني في سنه 2007 كانت تقريبا 2%. اليوم بجوز تفضلتي اخت زهره وذكرتي شيء بالنسبه للجائحه وتاثيراتها. اليوم في مثلا في 2020 في الولايات المتحده معدل ادخار الاسر تقريبا 13.7%. معروف طبعا في علم الاقتصاد انه احنا في حالات عدم اليقين بقول لك كاش از كينج، هولد ذا كاش. بصير في عندنا احنا بروبنسيتي انه نخلي الكاش معنا، لانه ببساطه شديده احنا مش متاكدين شو الظروف اللي بتواجهنا بالمستقبل، وبالتالي اللي بده يشتري سياره جديده بيأخر مشاريعه وكذا. بالاخص يعني بالنسبه للسلع المعمره، بالنسبه للديورابل جودز بصير شوي في اعاده ترتيب للاولويات. في عندنا اكستريم كيسز على سبيل المثال في فنلند على سبيل المثال معدل الادخار كان عندهم ماينس 0.4%. يعني ببساطه شديده هم باخذوا من المدخرات تبعتهم حتى يدعموا فيها الدخل وحتى يدعموا فيها الاستهلاك. يعني هم عايشين اليوم على حساب بكره، فهذا اكستريم. طبعا اذا بتطلع على احصائيات ديون الاسر مثلا كنسبه من الناتج المحلي الاجمالي، في بعض الدول بتشوفي انه نسبه ديون الاسر تفوق الناتج المحلي الاجمالي. يعني على سبيل المثال في 2016 في سويسرا كانت 128% ديون الاسر كنسبه من الناتج المحلي الاجمالي. طبعا اللي تفضلت فيه ايضا الدكتوره هبه هو موضوع بيهيفيرال. يعني الاقتصاد، النظريه الاقتصاديه البيور ايكونوميك ثيوري بتفترض انه الكونسيومر راشنال ماشي، بس طبعا يعني هذا الافتراض يعني قد لا يكون صحيح الى حد ما. يعني في ناس بتصرف بدون ما يكون في عندها رشد او رشاده في الانفاق. في عندنا حوافز معينه. ليش احنا بدخر حتى يكون في عندي تقاعد مريح على سبيل المثال، حتى انه ما اضطر انا اظل اشتغل حتى اخر لحظه بحياتي، عشان تعليم الابناء، عشان شراء بيت، عشان شراء سياره، مبلغ مثلا للاحتياجات الطارئه. ممكن الواحد يصير معه اشياء طارئه، ممكن بدخر عشان اعمل مشروع تجاري ويصير في عندي مثلا مصدر دخل اضافي. طبعا بعض الناس كمان يعني بفكر انه لازم يعني الانسان يستثمر مبالغ كبيره حتى يعني يصل الى مرحله من الرخاء المادي. هو هذا الفكره يعني مش دقيقه، لانه ببساطه شديده المثابره والاطار الزمني هو اللي بيؤدي انه الانسان يكون في عنده يعني وضع مادي مريح. بنعرف انه كثير متورطين بموضوع القروض الشخصيه، لكن حتى هذا موضوع القروض الشخصيه والاستهلاكيه، حتى موضوع القروض يمكن توظيفه يعني بطريقه رشيده وبطريقه منتجه. يعني انا اليوم لو كان في عندي تصور انه انا رحت على البنك، قدمت على قرض، اخذت هذا القرض استخدمته لشراء اصل منتج. مثلا خلينا نقول قطعه ارض بتوقع انه قيمتها تزيد مع مرور الوقت، او اشتريت بيت مثلا واجرت هذا البيت وصار يجيني منه دخل، والدخل اللي اجاني من هذا البيت انا صرت ايضا استخدمه لسداد القرض. طبعا في عندنا عوامل كثير تدخل في الموضوع. واحد بيقول انه يعني ممكن انا اوفر بشكل طوعي. في عوامل بتتحكم في الموضوع. يعني مثلا في عندك انت موضوع القيمه الزمنيه للنقود، تمام؟ يعني لو كنت انا الاطار الزمني، موضوع الاطار الزمني مهم جدا لانه بياثر على تحديد الادوات الاستثماريه، سواء كنت انت تطلع على مدى قصير او مدى متوسط او مدى طويل. يعني انا مثلا لو كنت بوفر بشكل طوعي لشراء بيت، ممكن انه انا بقول بدي اشتري بيت خلال 10 سنوات، ممكن ابدا بالتوفير انا بشكل طوعي، لكن بعد 10 سنوات اكتشف انه هذا البيت اللي انا كنت بدي اشتريه صار دبل او 3 اضعاف القيمه اللي كانت في وقت ففي عندنا موضوع التضخم، عندنا موضوع تآكل القيمة الشرائية، في عندنا موضوع القيمة الزمنية للنقود، في عندنا موضوع الإطار الزمني للادخار والاستثمار. طبعا في عندنا تحديات انه الواحد في حالة الادخار الطوعي ممكن ما يلتزم، لكن إذا أخذ قرض من البنك يعني هذا نوع من الادخار الإجباري. في بداية كل شهر بده البنك يأخذ القسط، وبالتالي المبلغ اللي بضل عندك بدك تدبر امورك فيه. ممكن الواحد يستهلك المدخرات، ممكن الفرصه الاستثماريه اللي كنت انا حاط عيني عليها تروح، ممكن اوضاع السوق تتبدل. طبعا هذا وارد جدا في العقارات. اهم شيء انه الانسان يعني لما يتطلع على سبيل المثال بده يشوف كمان الظروف المحليه. يعني عندنا في الامارات ممكن الواحد ياخذ قرض شخصي، بتشوفي احيانا اعلانات ل 2.5 ولا 2.6%. في بعض الدول الثانيه ما بتحصلي قرض حتى ب10 اضعاف هذه النسبه. فانت ايضا الانسان لما بده يدخر بده يشوف الاوبورتونيتي كوست، بده يشوف تكلفه الفرصه البديله، وبده يشوف هل انه العائد اللي راح يجي على المدخرات هل هو بغطي التضخم حتى ما تصير عندنا احنا القيمه الحقيقيه والسالب، هل بغطي تكلفه الفرصه البديله، هل لانه طبعا تعرفي في يعني موضوع تريد اوف، ما ممكن انه الانسان يحصل على كل شيء بنفس الوقت. التحديات كثيره. نعم تفضلي.
بالنسبة للتحديات دكتور سهل، في البداية أشكرك دكتور على التوضيح. طبعا السؤال التالي في جلستنا اليوم عن التحديات اللي تواجه الشباب في الادخار، فممكن يعني دكتور ممكن توضح يمكن هالجزئية بالنسبة ما هي التحديات اللي تواجه الشباب بالنسبة للادخار؟
شكرا أخ زهراء. أكيد يعني الموضوع مهم. أنا دائما بعتبر أنه البعد الثقافي في موضوع الاستهلاك والادخار بجوز يكون أهم الأبعاد، لأنه بتعرفي يعني موضوع نظرة المجتمع طبعا تأثير في عوامل ضاغطة. يعني أحيانا بتكون من المجتمع حتى أنه الإنسان يعني يظهر بمظهر معين أو يركب سيارة من نوع معين. يعني في كمان بير بريشر بسموه في اللي هو يعني انه الانسان ود ديمونستريشن افكت، انه الانسان بده يحاول انه يقلد يعني على البيئه المحيطه فيه. بالتالي لابد من مقاومه مظاهر الاستهلاك الترفي والعشوائي، يعني زي التوسع في الكماليات، السفر، التركيز على موضوع الماركات، او الانسياق خلف القروض الشخصيه. لانه بتعرف السيلز بيرسون تبعين البنوك عنده تارجت، بيجي يعني عنده استعداد انه يشجع الواحد ياخذ قرض في سبيل انه هو يحصل يعني يصل للتارجت تبعه ويحصل عليه كوميشن معين. من الضروري جدا انه نرسخ اسس المعرفه بالاداره الماليه، يكون في عندنا المهارات، كيف نعمل موازنه، كيف ندير موضوع الادخار والاستثمار، كيف ندير الدين اذا كان في عندنا دين. اداره الدين موضوع مهم جدا اللي تفضلت فيه ايضا الدكتوره هبه عن استخدام التطبيقات الحديثه في الاداره الماليه حتى على مستوى البيرسونال سيفنج. يعني مهم جدا نحاول ان نرسم خريطه امنه حتى نقدر ان نوائم ما بين الانفاق والدخل. واهم شيء انا بنظري مقاومه موضوع الخوف من الاتهام بالبخل حتى ما يتحول الادخار الى نوع من التهمه او السخريه. تمام؟ لانه طبعا هو في فرق عندنا بين البخل وبجوز والادخار، لانه يعني البخيل بيدخر بدون غايه، يعني بينما الانسان المنتج بيكون في عنده هدف بالدخل لغايه معينه. من المهم جدا ان يكون في عندنا بنيه تحتيه سليمه. هذه البنيه التحتيه الماليه السليمه في لها اعمده معينه، زي انه يكون في عندنا احنا حياه اقتصاديه رشيده، يكون في عندنا اصول قويه، يكون في عندنا رصيد للطوارئ لا سمح الله في حال وقوع طارئ معين، نقلل ما أمكن من الديون الموجودة عندنا، أن يكون في عندنا ثقافة مالية، ثقافة تخطيط، يكون عندنا تنظيم، يكون عندنا مصدر دخل قوي ومستمر. من الأمور اللي بتساعد أن يكون في عندنا موازنة. الموازنة بتعمل لي زي خريطة طريق، بتفرجيني الباترنز، أنماط الاستهلاك والإنفاق اللي عندي، بتكشف مصادر الهدر حتى أني أنا أقدر أتلافاها، بتساعدني على تسريع تحقيق الأهداف المالية، وبتنمي عندي أيضا عادات جديدة. إذا عرفت أنا يعني فلوسي وين بصرفها وين بتروح. لما أدخر بدي أعرف ما هو الحافز للادخار، كم الإطار الزمني مثل ما أشرنا حتى أحقق هذا الهدف، شو هي الموارد اللي بتلزمني حتى أحقق هذا الهدف، وكيف بقدر أحقق أهداف أو أضمن أهداف الادخار المالي، الادخار في الموازنة تبعي.
شكرا دكتور. في الختام طبعا مشكورين، شكرا دكتور. نشكر في البداية سعادة الوكيل، وأيضا نشكر الدكتورة هبة، وبالإضافة للدكتور سهل، مشكورين جميعا. أيضا نشكر جميع الحضور على مشاركتهم معنا اليوم في الجلسة. ونختم معكم جلستنا اليوم اللي تضمنت بشكل مختصر جوانب مهمة عن الادخار. طبعا تكلمنا عن أهمية الادخار وما هي ثقافة الادخار بشكل خاص بالنسبة لفئة الشباب. تكلمنا عن مفهوم الادخار، ثقافة الادخار، معدلات الادخار وآليات الادخار، بالإضافة إلى دور التقنيات الحديثة. في الختام أود أن أشكر كافة المتحدثين والحضور على مشاركتهم معنا اليوم في جلستنا الحوارية بعنوان الشباب ومبادئ الادخار. آملين أن نلتقي معكم إن شاء الله من جديد، وشكرا.
شكرا لك. شكرا.
شكرا. السلام عليكم.